Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, a place where science slows down just enough for us to notice it, where questions are allowed to linger, and where curiosity doesn't need to rush toward answers. This channel has always been about taking complex ideas and approaching them gently, carefully and without pressure. Not to oversimplify them, but to give them room to breathe. Tonight's topic is one of those ideas that quietly sits behind almost everything we do, yet rarely gets examined closely. It's something you use constantly, something you assume you have, and something that feels deeply personal. We're going to spend some time with the idea of free will. At first glance, free will seems almost too obvious to question. You chose to click on this video. You chose when to listen. You may have chosen where you're sitting right now, or whether the lights are on or off. These choices feel real, immediate, and entirely your own. They don't feel forced. They don't feel automatic. They feel intentional. And for most of our lives, that feeling is enough. We navigate the world on the assumption that we are the authors of our actions, that when we decide to speak, move, wait, or act, the decision originates somewhere inside us, somewhere personal, somewhere private. But science has a habit of quietly revisiting the things we take for granted, not to strip them of meaning, but to ask how they actually work. Over the past century, neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, and physicists have all circled around the same question from different angles. When you make a decision, where does it really begin? Does it start with conscious intention, or does that intention arrive late to the process? Are your choices the result of an inner freedom, or are they the final outcome of biological processes that were already unfolding before you became aware of them? These aren't questions meant to unsettle you, at least not tonight. They're questions meant to be approached slowly, with care, and without the expectation that we'll tie everything up neatly. Because free will isn't a switch that's either on or off. It's a concept that sits at the intersection of how the brain works, how behavior emerges, and how we understand responsibility, identity, and control. And like many ideas at that intersection, it becomes less simple the closer you look. Before we go any further, let me ask you something small and personal. Where are you listening from right now? Are you at home or somewhere unfamiliar? Is it early in the day or late enough that the world outside has gone quiet? Questions like these aren't just tradition here. They matter because they remind us that every listener arrives with a different set of circumstances, a different body state, a different mood, and a different history. And all of those factors play a role in how choices are made, even when we're not thinking about them. If you find this space calming, thoughtful, or simply useful as a way to wind down, you're very welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this channel reach others who enjoy learning without urgency. But there's no pressure. You don't need to decide anything right now. Just listening is enough. Now, when most people hear the phrase free will, they don't think of laboratory experiments or brain scans. They think of everyday moments, deciding what to say in a conversation, choosing whether to get up or stay seated, weighing options, feeling hesitation, changing one's mind. These experiences give rise to a powerful sense of authorship. It feels as though there is a central you inside the mind, observing possibilities and selecting one. This sense of agency is so strong that questioning it can feel almost absurd, like questioning whether you're really seeing the colour blue. And yet, when scientists began to look closely at the timing of decisions inside the brain, something unexpected appeared. Neural activity associated with decisions often begins before a person becomes consciously aware of having made a choice. In other words, by the time you feel like you've decided, parts of your brain may have already been moving in that direction. This doesn't mean your choices are fake, but it does complicate the story we usually tell ourselves about how decisions happen. To understand why this matters, it helps to recognize how deeply free will is woven into everyday life. Legal systems rely on it. Moral judgments depend on it. Praise, blame, pride, regret, and forgiveness all assume that people could have acted differently. When someone apologizes, they're not just acknowledging an outcome, they're acknowledging a choice. When we plan for the future, we assume that our actions can influence what comes next. Free will isn't just a philosophical idea, it's a practical one. So when science asks whether free will exists, it isn't asking whether people make choices at all. Clearly they do. The question is more precise than that. It's asking whether the conscious experience of choosing is the origin of action, or whether it's one part of a larger process that's already underway. And if it's the latter, then what exactly is consciousness doing in the decision-making process? One way to think about this is to imagine a news broadcast that reports events as they happen. The report feels immediate, current, and informative, but the event itself began before it appeared on the screen. The broadcast didn't cause the event, it made you aware of it. Some researchers suggest that conscious intention may function in a similar way, not as the initiator of action, but as the system that becomes aware of decisions as they form. That idea can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if it sounds like it's pushing humans into the category of passive observers, but that interpretation goes too far, too fast. The brain isn't separate from you, it is you in a biological sense. The processes unfolding beneath awareness are still part of the same system that thinks, learns, reflects, and adapts. The real question isn't whether decisions are caused, but how much control we have over the conditions that shape them. Consider how often choices are influenced by factors you didn't select. Your genetics, your early experiences, the culture you grew up in, the language you speak, even the state of your body in a given moment. Hunger, fatigue, stress, and emotion all subtly tilt decisions in one direction or another. And yet, within those constraints, people still reflect, reconsider, resist impulses, and change course. That ability to pause, evaluate, and redirect behavior is often what people mean when they talk about free will, even if they don't use that language explicitly. This is where the conversation becomes more nuanced. Free will doesn't have to mean complete independence from cause and effect. It doesn't require decisions to appear from nowhere. In fact, decisions that weren't influenced by reasons, preferences, or values wouldn't feel free at all. They would feel random. What matters is whether actions flow from the internal states that define a person, their beliefs, goals, and understanding, rather than from external coercion or uncontrollable compulsion. As we move forward, we'll look at the experiments that brought these questions into the spotlight, including the studies that measured brain activity milliseconds before conscious choice. We'll talk about what those results actually show and what they don't. We'll explore older philosophical debates that long predate modern neuroscience, because questions about free will didn't start in a lab. They started with people trying to understand responsibility, intention, and change. We'll also take time to look at what happens when belief in free will weakens. Some studies suggest that when people feel they have no control, their behavior changes. Motivation drops. Accountability blurs. But other research suggests that understanding the limits of control can actually increase compassion, both toward others and toward oneself. These effects don't point in a single direction. They suggest that how we frame free will matters as much as where we land on the question. For now, it's enough to stay with the uncertainty, to notice how natural it feels to assume choice, and how strange it feels to examine that assumption closely. You don't need to resolve anything yet. You don't need to decide what you believe. Just let the question sit with you as we continue, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to understand how decisions really unfold, one moment at a time. When people talk about free will in everyday life, they rarely stop to define what they mean. The phrase is used casually, almost automatically, as if its meaning were obvious and shared by everyone. We say someone acted of their own free will, or that a choice was freely made, or that a person could have done otherwise. These phrases feel intuitive, but when you slow them down and examine them, they begin to point in different directions. Free will, it turns out, is not a single idea. It's a bundle of related assumptions that often get grouped together without much scrutiny. At its most basic level, free will usually means that a person is able to choose between alternatives, not just in the sense that multiple options exist, but that the person has some meaningful role in selecting one over the others. If you choose tea instead of coffee, or decide to speak instead of staying silent, it feels like something you actively did. The choice doesn't feel like it happened to you. It feels like it came from you. That feeling is central to what most people mean by free will. But even in this simple example, questions start to appear. Did you choose tea because you genuinely preferred it in that moment? Or because you were tired? Or because you had coffee earlier? Or because you associate tea with calm evenings? All of those factors can influence the outcome, and most of them weren't consciously selected at the time. Yet the choice still feels voluntary. This suggests that free will, at least as people experience it, doesn't require complete independence from influence. It requires something else. Another common assumption tied to free will is the idea that you could have done otherwise. Looking back at a decision, it often feels as though multiple futures were available, and you selected one. If someone asks why you made a particular choice, you can usually give reasons, and if pressed, you might say that you could have chosen differently if you had wanted to. This sense of alternative possibility is deeply tied to how we assign responsibility. If a person truly could not have acted differently, we tend to see them as less blameworthy. However, this idea of could have done otherwise becomes more complicated when you examine it closely. Does it mean that, given the exact same circumstances, internal states, and information, you could have chosen a different option? Or does it mean that if something had been different, such as your mood or your knowledge, then a different choice would have followed? These two interpretations sound similar, but they carry very different implications. In everyday conversation, people often slide between them without noticing. They say someone could have done otherwise, but what they really mean is that under slightly different conditions, the outcome might have changed. That's almost always true, but it doesn't necessarily imply the kind of freedom people often imagine, where choices emerge independently of prior causes. There's also a moral layer to how free will is understood. When we say someone acted freely, we usually mean they weren't forced, threatened, or coerced. If a person hands over their wallet because someone is holding a weapon, we don't say the action was fully free, even though they technically made a choice. This highlights another important component of free will in common usage, the absence of external constraint. In this sense, free will isn't about whether actions have causes, it's about whether those causes include undue pressure from outside the person. A decision made under compulsion feels different from one made under normal conditions. The presence or absence of coercion matters, and most legal and social systems recognize this distinction. Consent, responsibility, and accountability all depend on it. But once external force is removed, we often assume freedom automatically fills the gap. If no one made you do it, then you must have freely chosen it. This assumption is rarely questioned in daily life, but it becomes less clear when internal constraints are considered. Habits, addictions, emotional patterns, and automatic responses can limit choice in ways that feel less obvious than physical force, yet just as powerful. Someone struggling with addiction may not feel fully in control of their actions, even in the absence of external pressure. Similarly, a person reacting out of intense fear or anger might later say they weren't really themselves in that moment. These experiences complicate the simple idea that freedom exists whenever no one is forcing you from the outside. This leads to an important realization. When people talk about free will, they're often talking about degrees, not absolutes. Actions can feel more or less free depending on context, mental state, and available options. We already operate with this understanding intuitively. We excuse behavior when someone is exhausted, overwhelmed, or impaired. We expect more control from someone who is calm, informed, and reflective. Free will, in practice, is something we already treat as flexible. Despite this, philosophical discussions often push the concept toward extremes. Either free will exists fully and independently, or it doesn't exist at all. but that framing doesn't reflect how the concept actually functions in human life. Most people don't need their choices to be uncaused or mysterious. They need them to be connected to who they are, what they care about, and what they understand. This brings us to another important distinction: free will as authorship. When you say you chose something freely, you're not usually claiming that the choice came from nowhere. You're claiming ownership of it. The decision reflects your preferences, your values, or your reasoning. It feels like an expression of you rather than something imposed. Authorship doesn't require randomness. In fact, random actions don't feel free in this sense at all. If you flipped a coin to decide what to do, you might accept the outcome, but you wouldn't feel the same sense of personal involvement. The decision wouldn't say much about you. It would just be something that happened. This is why randomness doesn't rescue free will when determinism becomes uncomfortable. If choices were purely random, they wouldn't be under meaningful control. Free will, as most people care about it, involves control guided by reasons. It's about acting in line with motivations, even if those motivations themselves have causes. The confusion around free will often comes from mixing these different meanings together. Sometimes people mean freedom from external coercion. Sometimes they mean the capacity to deliberate and reflect. Sometimes they mean ultimate independence from cause and effect. These are not the same thing, but they often get bundled into a single phrase. When neuroscience enters the conversation, this lack of clarity becomes especially important. Studies that show unconscious brain activity preceding conscious awareness don't necessarily undermine all forms of free will. They challenge a specific version of it, the idea that conscious intention is always the starting point of action. But if free will is understood as the ability to act in accordance with one's reasons, values, and long-term goals, then the picture looks different. The brain doesn't stop being yours just because some of its processes occur outside awareness. Much of what allows you to function at all happens automatically. Language comprehension, motor coordination, and emotional regulation all rely on systems that operate without constant conscious supervision. Yet we don't say that speaking or walking isn't something you do. We recognize that conscious control exists alongside automatic processes, not in isolation from them. Another way people often talk about free will is through the idea of self-control. Being able to resist temptations, delay gratification, or override impulses feels like a clear expression of freedom. When you choose the long-term benefit over the short-term reward, it feels as though you're exercising control rather than being pushed around by immediate urges. Interestingly, this version of free will depends heavily on the brain's ability to inhibit actions, not just initiate them. Stopping yourself from doing something can feel just as significant as deciding to act. This kind of control is closely tied to attention, working memory, and emotional regulation. It's not a mysterious force. It's a set of cognitive abilities that develop over time and vary between individuals. This has important implications. If free will is closely tied to these abilities, then it can be strengthened or weakened. Sleep deprivation, stress, trauma, and illness can all reduce self-control. Training, support, and stable environments can enhance it. This makes free will less like a fixed trait and more like a capacity that depends on conditions. In everyday life, people already recognize this. We don't expect the same level of deliberation from a child as from an adult. We don't judge someone experiencing a medical emergency in the same way as someone acting calmly. These judgments aren't arbitrary. They reflect an implicit understanding that freedom involves certain cognitive capacities, and that those capacities can be compromised. When free will is framed this way, it stops being an all-or-nothing property and starts looking more like a spectrum. The question becomes not, do you have free will or not, but under what conditions do people have more or less control over their actions? This is a question science is much better equipped to explore. Still, there's a lingering concern that often comes up. If every decision can be traced back to prior causes, brain states, and environmental influences, does that mean no one is truly responsible for anything? This fear rests on the assumption that responsibility requires ultimate independence. But that assumption is not as widely accepted as it might seem. In practice, responsibility is usually about responsiveness. Can a person understand reasons? Can they adjust their behaviour when given feedback? Can they reflect on consequences and modify future actions? These abilities matter far more in real-world contexts than metaphysical independence. A person who cannot respond to reasons, who cannot learn or adjust, is treated differently by society. Not because we think they lack some abstract freedom, but because they lack practical control. This again suggests that what people care about when they care about free will is functionality, not metaphysical purity. The idea that free will must be completely uncaused often comes from a desire to protect moral significance. But it may be protecting the wrong thing. Meaningful agency doesn't require that choices appear out of nowhere. It requires that actions flow from the kind of system that can understand, evaluate, and respond. As we continue, it will become important to keep these distinctions in mind. When experiments suggest that decisions begin before conscious awareness, they're not automatically answering the question people think they're answering. They're illuminating one part of a much larger process. To understand what those findings mean, we first have to be clear about what we mean by free will in the first place. For now, it's enough to notice how many layers the concept already has: choice, control, authorship, responsibility, absence of coercion, capacity for reflection. All of these are wrapped into the phrase without being unpacked, and once you begin to separate them, the question of free will doesn't disappear. It becomes sharper, more specific, and more grounded in how minds and brains actually work. With that groundwork in place, the next step is to look more closely at the experience of choosing itself. Not the abstract idea of free will, but what it feels like in real time, moment by moment, when a decision is forming and awareness catches up to it. There is a moment that happens so often you barely notice it. You reach for something, hesitate briefly, and then act. You decide to speak or stay quiet. You choose one option and let another go. In that moment, it feels as though something inside you has weighed possibilities and settled on a direction. This feeling is subtle, but it is powerful. It is the feeling of choosing, and for most people, it is the most convincing evidence that free will exists at all. What makes this feeling so persuasive is how immediate it is. You don't usually experience your decisions as the end of a long causal chain. You experience them as events that happen now. There is a sense of presence to them, a sense that the decision belongs to the current moment and to you. Even when you reflect later and recognize influences or pressures, the original experience often remains intact. At the time, it felt like a choice. Psychologically, this feeling is closely tied to the sense of agency. Agency is the experience of being the one who initiates actions. It is the feeling that movements, words, and decisions are coming from you, rather than merely happening through you. Agency is not the same thing as control in an objective sense. It is a subjective experience, generated by the brain, and like all experiences, it can be shaped, distorted, or interrupted under certain conditions. One reason the feeling of choosing is so compelling is that it usually coincides with conscious awareness. You become aware of options, consider them briefly, and then one option becomes dominant. This sequence creates a narrative. First there were alternatives, then there was deliberation, then there was choice. The narrative feels linear and intuitive, but the brain does not always work in neat sequences, and awareness is not always present at the beginning of a process. In many cases, by the time you become aware of a decision, the brain has already done a great deal of work. Preferences have been activated. Emotional responses have been evaluated. Past experiences have been consulted. None of this feels like a committee meeting in the mind. It feels like clarity arriving. One option simply feels right, or at least more right than the others. This is not an illusion in the sense of being fake or meaningless. The feeling corresponds to real neural processes, but it is an interpretation, not a direct readout of everything that happened. The brain presents the outcome of its processing as a unified experience. I decided. That experience is useful. It allows you to plan, explain yourself to others, and maintain a coherent sense of identity. Without it, life would feel fragmented and confusing. To see how constructed this feeling is, it helps to look at situations where it breaks down. One well-known example comes from experiments involving involuntary movement. In certain neurological conditions, people may experience movements that they did not intend, such as tics or spasms. In these cases, the movement happens without the accompanying sense of agency. The person may say, "That wasn't me," even though the movement came from their own body. Conversely, there are situations where people feel agency even when they did not cause the action. In experiments where participants' movements are subtly guided or predicted, people sometimes report having chosen an action that was actually influenced or initiated externally. The feeling of choosing can be generated even when control is partial or absent. These findings suggest that the feeling of choosing is not a perfect indicator of how decisions are generated. It is a signal constructed by the brain under certain conditions. When intentions, actions, and outcomes align closely in time, the brain infers authorship. When they don't, the sense of agency weakens or disappears. Timing plays a crucial role here. Studies have shown that when there is a delay between an intention and an action, or between an action and its outcome, the sense of agency diminishes. The brain expects a tight temporal relationship. When things happen too early or too late, the feeling of "I did this" becomes less convincing. This matters for free will because it shows that the experience of choosing depends on how information is integrated, not just on whether a choice occurred. You might still be the causal agent in a meaningful sense, but if the signals are disrupted, the feeling doesn't appear. This suggests that the feeling of choosing is something the brain produces after certain conditions are met, not a raw perception of causal power. Another factor shaping the feeling of choosing is effort. Decisions that require conscious effort tend to feel more freely chosen than decisions that happen quickly or automatically. When you pause, reflect, and struggle between options, the eventual choice feels more deliberate. In contrast, snap decisions often feel automatic, even if they align perfectly with your goals and values. Interestingly, effort itself is not a reliable indicator of control. Some highly practiced skills involve little conscious effort, but still reflect deep learning and intentionality. A skilled musician doesn't deliberate over every finger movement, yet their performance is clearly an expression of their agency. Meanwhile, a difficult decision made under confusion or stress may involve a lot of effort, but little actual control. What effort seems to do is amplify awareness. It brings more of the decision-making process into consciousness. This makes the narrative of choosing richer and more detailed. You can recall reasons, conflicts, and turning points. The story feels complete. When effort is low, the story is thinner, and the sense of choice may feel weaker, even if the underlying processes are just as personal. Emotion also plays a central role. Choices made under strong emotion can feel both intensely personal and strangely uncontrollable. Someone might say, "I don't know why I did that, I just felt it," even though the action reflects their emotional priorities at the time. Emotions are not external forces acting on the mind. They are part of the decision-making system, but because they operate quickly and often outside deliberate reasoning, they can make choices feel less chosen, even when they are deeply expressive of a person's values. Fear is a particularly clear example. Under threat, the brain prioritizes speed over deliberation. Decisions are made rapidly, sometimes before conscious awareness catches up. Later, people may struggle to explain their actions or feel as though they acted without choosing. Yet the brain was still responding in a way shaped by evolution, learning, and context. This highlights an important point. The feeling of choosing is not required for choice to occur. Decisions can happen without it. But the feeling plays a key role in how we interpret those decisions afterward. It influences whether we take responsibility, feel regret, or see ourselves as the kind of person who would act that way. Memory further complicates the picture. We often reconstruct our decisions after the fact, filling in gaps with plausible reasons. This reconstruction feels seamless, but it's not always accurate. People are surprisingly poor at introspecting about why they made certain choices. When asked, they often provide explanations that feel true but don't match the actual influences involved. This doesn't mean people are lying. It means the brain is good at generating coherent narratives. The feeling of choosing is part of that narrative. It creates continuity across time, allowing you to see yourself as a consistent agent rather than a collection of disconnected reactions. There is also the issue of prediction. In recent years, researchers have developed systems that can predict certain choices before a person reports having made them. These predictions are not perfect, but they are better than chance. This has led some to claim that free will is an illusion, because decisions can be anticipated before conscious awareness. But prediction does not equal causation, and it does not eliminate agency. If someone knows your preferences well enough, they can often predict what you'll choose. That doesn't mean you didn't choose it. The brain's patterns reflect stable traits, habits, and goals. Predictability is a feature of agency, not necessarily a flaw in it. The key issue is whether conscious awareness is the initiator of decisions or one component in a distributed process. The feeling of choosing suggests initiation, but the underlying processes suggest integration. Consciousness may not start the process, but it can shape it by bringing certain information into focus, by allowing reflection, and by enabling long-term planning. One way to think about this is to compare decision-making to steering rather than pushing. You may not generate the engine's power, but you can influence direction over time. The feeling of choosing may correspond to moments when steering is most salient, when options are evaluated and priorities are adjusted. This interpretation preserves much of what people care about in free will without requiring that consciousness operate as a detached commander issuing orders. Instead, it becomes a coordinating system, one that integrates information, evaluates outcomes, and modulates behavior. Importantly, the feeling of choosing is shaped by learning. Children gradually develop a stronger sense of agency as they gain control over their bodies and environments. Early in life, many actions are exploratory and reactive. Over time, as patterns stabilize and feedback accumulates, choices feel more intentional. This development suggests that agency is built, not discovered. Cultural factors also influence how the feeling of choosing is experienced. Some cultures emphasize individual choice and personal responsibility more strongly than others. This can shape how people interpret their own actions. The underlying decision processes may be similar, but the narrative around them differs. What feels like a deeply personal choice in one context may feel like a natural response to circumstances in another. All of this points to a central idea. The feeling of choosing is real, meaningful, and informative, but it is not a transparent window into causation. It is an experience generated by the brain to make sense of action. It highlights certain aspects of decision-making while leaving others in the background. As we move forward, this distinction will become increasingly important. When we examine experiments that appear to show decisions happening before awareness, we'll need to ask what exactly awareness contributes. Does it initiate action, or does it shape, interpret, and sometimes override processes already in motion? For now, it's enough to sit with the experience itself, to notice how natural it feels to say "I decided," and how rarely we question what that phrase contains. The feeling of choosing is not something to be dismissed or reduced away. It is a central part of how humans navigate the world. But understanding how it arises requires us to look beneath the surface, into timing, integration, and the quiet work of the brain that makes choice feel like choice at all. Long before free will became something measured in brain scans or debated in scientific journals, it was already doing important work in human thought. People were trying to make sense of praise and blame, responsibility and regret, long before they had words like neurons or neurotransmitters. The history of free will is not a straight line toward clarity. It's a long conversation, shaped by religion, law, metaphysics, and everyday experience, with each era redefining the problem in terms it could understand. In the ancient world, questions about free will were closely tied to questions about fate. Many early cultures believed that events unfolded according to forces beyond human control. The movements of the stars, the will of the gods, or an impersonal cosmic order were thought to shape human lives. And yet, even within these frameworks, people still held one another accountable. Heroes were praised for courage, villains blamed for betrayal. This tension between fate and responsibility is one of the earliest signs that free will was already a problem, even if it didn't yet have that name. In ancient Greece, philosophers began to approach the issue more systematically. Rather than asking only what the gods intended, they asked what it meant for a person to act voluntarily. Aristotle was especially influential here. He wasn't interested in whether actions were uncaused. Instead, he focused on whether actions originated from within the agent. For Aristotle, a voluntary action was one that came from the person and was done with knowledge of the circumstances. If someone acted under compulsion or ignorance, their responsibility was reduced. This way of thinking already resembles how we treat responsibility today. Aristotle recognized that people are shaped by habits and character, which develop over time through repeated actions. In this sense, who you are influences what you do, and what you do reinforces who you are. Free will was not a mysterious power hovering outside the natural world. It was embedded in character, reason, and practical judgment. At the same time, Greek philosophers were deeply concerned with causation. If the world operates according to reason and necessity, where does choice fit? Some schools, like the Stoics, argued that everything happens according to a rational order. From their perspective, freedom didn't mean escaping causation. It meant aligning oneself willingly with what must happen anyway. You were free not because you could change fate, but because you could accept it rationally. Other thinkers were less comfortable with this reconciliation. The idea that everything was predetermined seemed to threaten moral responsibility. If your actions were inevitable, how could you truly be praised or blamed? This tension never fully disappeared. It simply changed shape over time. As philosophical attention shifted from Greece to the Roman world and later to early Christian thought, free will took on a new role. It became central to questions of sin, salvation, and moral accountability. In this context, the stakes were no longer just social or ethical, they were eternal. One of the most influential figures in this period was Augustine of Hippo. Augustine wrestled deeply with the problem of free will, especially in relation to divine foreknowledge and grace. If God knows everything that will happen, including human actions, how can those actions be free? And if humans are born with a tendency towards sin, how can they be held responsible? Augustine argued that humans do possess free will, but that their will is damaged. According to him, people are free to choose, but without divine assistance, they tend to choose wrongly. This allowed Augustine to preserve both moral responsibility and the need for grace. Free will existed, but it was not sufficient on its own to guarantee good action. This idea shaped centuries of theological debate. Free will was no longer just about choice. It was about moral struggle. The will could be divided against itself, pulled between desire and duty. This internal conflict became a central feature of how people understood human nature. During the medieval period, philosophers continued to refine these ideas, often working within religious frameworks. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas tried to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. Aquinas argued that human reason and divine order were not in conflict. For him, free will was the ability to act according to reason, guided by an understanding of the good. Importantly, Aquinas did not think free will required randomness or independence from cause. He believed that rational deliberation itself was a causal process, one that allowed humans to act purposefully. The will followed reason, and reason could evaluate alternatives. In this view, freedom was not the absence of influence, but the presence of understanding. As Europe moved toward the early modern period, the conversation began to shift again. Scientific discoveries were transforming how people thought about the universe. The natural world increasingly appeared to operate according to laws that could be described mathematically. Motion, force, and cause began to look predictable. This raised a new version of an old problem. If nature is governed by laws, are human beings exceptions, or are they part of the same system? This question became especially pressing during the rise of mechanical philosophy. Thinkers like René Descartes argued that the physical world operated like a machine, governed by deterministic laws. To preserve human freedom, Descartes famously divided reality into two substances, mind and matter. The body followed physical laws, but the mind was non-physical and capable of free choice. This dualistic solution protected free will by placing it outside the reach of physical causation. But it came at a cost. It raised difficult questions about how an immaterial mind could interact with a physical body. Those questions never received fully satisfying answers, and the mind-body divide remains a source of debate today. Not all philosophers were convinced by this approach. Baruch Spinoza, for example, rejected the idea of free will as commonly understood. He argued that everything, including human thoughts and actions, follows necessarily from the nature of reality. For Spinoza, the feeling of freedom came from ignorance of causes. We believe we are free because we do not understand the forces that shape our desires. This was a radical view, and it was deeply unsettling to many of his contemporaries. But Spinoza did not see it as dehumanizing. He believed that understanding the causes of our actions could actually increase our freedom by freeing us from confusion and passive emotion. Freedom, in his sense, meant understanding necessity, not escaping it. A similar tension appears in the work of David Hume, who tackled the problem from a more psychological angle. Hume argued that free will and determinism were not necessarily incompatible. He suggested that freedom consists in acting according to one's desires without external constraint. If your actions flow from your character and intentions, you are free, even if those intentions have causes. This view, often called compatibilism, marked an important shift. Instead of asking whether actions were caused, Hume asked whether they were coerced. Instead of seeking metaphysical independence, he focused on practical freedom. This approach would later become highly influential, especially as science continued to reveal the causal structure of the world. As the Enlightenment progressed, confidence in reason and science grew. Human behavior increasingly became a subject of study rather than introspection alone. Economists, psychologists, and political theorists began modeling human action in terms of incentives, preferences, and constraints. The idea of a completely uncaused will began to look less plausible, and for many, less necessary. By the 19th century, theories of evolution added another layer. If humans evolved through natural selection, then mental traits, including decision-making processes, must have evolutionary histories. Desires, habits, and tendencies were shaped by survival and reproduction. Choice began to look like a biological function rather than a metaphysical mystery. This did not eliminate free will from discussion, but it changed the terms. The question was no longer whether humans were special exceptions to nature, but how complex systems like brains generate flexible behavior. Freedom began to be associated with adaptability, learning, and self-regulation rather than exemption from causation. In the 20th century, psychology and neuroscience accelerated this shift. Behaviorists emphasized environmental conditioning. Later, cognitive scientists focused on information processing. Each framework challenged the idea that conscious choice was the sole driver of action. Yet at the same time, legal and moral systems continued to rely on notions of responsibility and intent. This produced a kind of split. Scientifically, behavior looked increasingly mechanistic and explainable. Socially, people still experienced themselves as choosing agents. The history of free will did not converge on a single answer. Instead, it branched into multiple ways of understanding what freedom might mean. What's striking about this long history is how rarely the debate has been purely abstract. Questions about free will always arise because something practical is at stake. Who should be blamed? Who should be punished? Who deserves credit? Who can change? Each era reshaped the concept to fit its concerns. The ancient world focused on virtue and character. The medieval world focused on sin and salvation. The early modern world focused on science and mechanism. Today, the focus is increasingly on the brain. But the core tension remains the same. How can humans be part of a causal world and still be agents in any meaningful sense? Understanding this history helps clarify why modern debates about free will can feel so charged. They're not just about data or experiments. They're about centuries of assumptions layered on top of one another. When someone says free will is an illusion, they may be rejecting one historical version while leaving others untouched. As we move forward, it will be important to remember that free will has never meant just one thing. Its meaning has shifted as our understanding of the world has changed. The neuroscientific questions we're about to explore didn't arise in a vacuum. They are the latest chapter in a very old conversation, one that has always reflected how humans understand themselves and their place in the world. With that context in mind, we can now turn toward the brain itself, not to settle the debate once and for all, but to see how modern science has added new details to a question people have been asking for as long as they've reflected on their own actions. When people imagine making a decision, they often picture a clear sequence. First, a thought appears, then it is considered, then a choice is made, and finally, the body acts. This sequence feels intuitive because it mirrors how decisions are remembered and explained after the fact. But when researchers began looking closely at what the brain is actually doing in the moments leading up to a decision, the timeline turned out to be less straightforward. Long before you become consciously aware of deciding, your brain is already active. Electrical signals are shifting. Networks are adjusting their activity. Information from memory, emotion, and perception is being integrated. None of this feels like decision-making from the inside. There is no announcement, no clear starting gun. The brain simply moves, continuously, seamlessly, from one state to the next. This is not surprising when you consider how the brain works in general. It is not an organ that waits for instructions and then executes them. It is constantly active, constantly predicting, evaluating, and preparing. Even at rest, neural circuits are busy maintaining patterns, anticipating outcomes, and updating internal models of the world. Decisions emerge from this ongoing activity rather than interrupting it. One way to understand this is to think about the brain as a system that is always leaning slightly toward future action. At any given moment, there are multiple possible behaviors available to you. You could speak, stay silent, move, wait, or shift attention. The brain does not hold all these possibilities in a neutral state. Instead, it continuously biases them based on context, goals, and past experience. If you are hungry, actions related to food are more active in the background. If you are tired, actions involving rest become more likely. If you are in a social situation, responses related to speech and expression are primed. This background preparation happens automatically. You are not aware of it, but it shapes what will feel like an option when the moment of choice arrives. Crucially, this preparation does not feel like decision-making. It feels like nothing at all. And yet, it plays a major role in what you eventually do. By the time you consciously experience the moment of choosing, the field of possibilities has already been narrowed. Some options feel natural, others barely register. This is not because the brain is hiding something from you. It is because conscious awareness has limited bandwidth. If you are aware of every competing impulse, memory activation, and motor preparation, you would be overwhelmed. Instead, the brain presents a simplified summary. It delivers a manageable set of options, along with a sense of readiness to act. From a neuroscientific perspective, a decision is not a single event. It is a process that unfolds over time. Early stages involve gathering information and setting priorities. Later stages involve committing to an action and suppressing alternatives. Conscious awareness tends to appear somewhere in the middle of this process, not at the beginning. This is where the idea of the brain before the decision becomes important. When researchers measure brain activity in the seconds or even milliseconds leading up to a reported choice, they often see patterns that correlate with the eventual outcome. Certain regions show increased activity. Certain motor plans become more likely. Importantly, these patterns can sometimes be detected before a person reports having decided. At first glance, this seems to suggest that the brain decides before you do. But that framing can be misleading. There is no separate you waiting outside the brain to issue commands. The brain activity is not something happening to you. It is part of the same system that eventually produces conscious awareness. The real question is not whether the brain is active before a decision. It always is. The question is, what role conscious awareness plays in the process. Is it merely observing the outcome, or is it shaping the trajectory as it unfolds? To answer that, it helps to distinguish between different kinds of decisions. Not all choices are equal. Some are spontaneous and low stakes. Others are slow, deliberate, and complex. The brain's activity before these decisions looks very different. In quick, simple choices such as pressing a button or choosing between two similar options, preparation happens rapidly and often without conscious deliberation. The brain may settle into a particular pattern quickly, and awareness arrives just as the action is being finalized. In these cases, it can feel as though the decision happened instantly. In more complex decisions, the timeline stretches out. You weigh consequences, you imagine outcomes, you revisit memories. Here, conscious awareness plays a much larger role. It allows information to be held in mind, compared and evaluated over longer periods. The brain is still preparing in the background, but awareness influences which factors are emphasized. This distinction matters because many famous experiments on decision-making focus on very simple actions. They are designed to isolate timing and measure neural signals precisely. But these tasks do not capture the full range of human choice. They tell us something important about how decisions begin, but not everything about how decisions are guided. Another key aspect of brain activity before a decision is inhibition. Choosing is not just about selecting one action. It is also about suppressing others. At any moment, multiple responses are competing for expression. The brain must actively inhibit those that are inappropriate or less relevant. This inhibitory control is a major component of what people experience as self-control. When you resist an impulse, you're not generating a new desire out of nothing. You're strengthening one signal and dampening another. This process begins before awareness and continues during conscious deliberation. Importantly, inhibition is sensitive to conditions. Fatigue, stress, alcohol, and emotional overload can all weaken it. When inhibition fails, actions can feel impulsive or automatic. Later, people may say they weren't thinking, which is often accurate. The brain's capacity to regulate competing signals was temporarily reduced. This again shows that freedom is not a binary property. The brain's ability to prepare, regulate, and revise actions varies from moment to moment. The feeling of choosing depends on how smoothly these processes are coordinated. There is also the role of prediction. The brain is constantly predicting the outcomes of actions before they happen. These predictions influence which actions feel attractive or risky. If an action is predicted to lead to a negative outcome, its activation is suppressed. If it is predicted to lead to a positive outcome, its activation increases. These predictions are shaped by learning. Past experiences leave traces in neural circuits, making some outcomes feel more likely than others. Over time, this allows the brain to act efficiently without constant deliberation. You don't need to consciously decide how to walk, speak, or recognize familiar situations. The brain prepares those actions automatically. From the inside, this efficiency feels like intuition. You just know what to do, but intuition is not magic. It is the result of extensive prior processing that happens below awareness. When intuition works well, it feels like freedom. When it misfires, it can feel like loss of control. One concern that often arises at this point is whether all this preparation leaves any room for genuine choice. If the brain is already leaning toward an action before awareness, what is left for you to do? The answer lies in flexibility. Preparation does not equal inevitability. Early neural biases can be overridden. The brain is not a rigid machine marching toward a fixed outcome. It is a dynamic system that can revise its trajectory in response to new information. Conscious awareness plays a key role here. By bringing certain thoughts, values, or future consequences into focus, awareness can alter the balance of competing signals. This does not mean awareness creates decisions from scratch. It means it can modulate ongoing processes. Think of it as adjusting weights rather than flipping switches. The decision process begins before awareness, but it does not end there. Awareness can strengthen some tendencies, weaken others, and sometimes stop an action altogether. This is especially clear in situations where people change their minds. You may begin to act, feel a moment of hesitation, and then stop. That hesitation reflects a late arriving signal that altered the process. Without awareness, such adjustments would be much harder. This capacity to revise is one of the strongest candidates for what people intuitively mean by control. It is not about being the first cause. It is about being able to intervene, reflect, and redirect. From a scientific standpoint, this makes sense. Conscious processing is slower and more resource-intensive than automatic processing. It is not designed to run everything. It is designed to handle situations where flexibility matters, where rules conflict, or where long-term consequences need to be considered. So when the brain begins preparing an action before awareness, that is not evidence against agency. It is evidence that agency is layered. Fast, automatic systems handle routine preparation. Slower, reflective systems handle monitoring and adjustment. Problems arise when these systems are misaligned. When automatic preparation pushes strongly in one direction, and reflective awareness arrives too late or too weakly, actions can feel out of control. When awareness arrives early enough, and with enough clarity, actions feel deliberate. This brings us back to the feeling of choosing. That feeling does not mark the absolute beginning of decision-making. It marks a point where information becomes available to conscious reflection and influence. It is a moment of access, not origin. As we continue, this timing issue will become even more important. In the next step, we will look at a specific set of experiments that made this idea famous. Experiments that seemed to show decisions happening before people knew they had made them. Those findings caused a great deal of controversy, not because they were shocking to neuroscientists, but because they collided so directly with everyday intuitions about when and how choice begins. In the early 1980s, a series of experiments entered the scientific conversation and refused to leave. They were simple in design, careful in execution, and explosive in implication. For many people, these experiments became the moment when free will seemed to slip out of reach and turn into something illusory. At the center of this story was a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet, whose work would be cited, criticized, defended, and misunderstood for decades to come. The basic setup of Libet's experiment was straightforward. Participants were asked to perform a very simple voluntary action, such as flexing their wrist or pressing a button whenever they felt like it. There was no external cue, no instruction about timing, and no reason to choose one moment over another. At the same time, their brain activity was measured using electroencephalography, or EEG, which detects changes in electrical signals across the scalp. Libet was particularly interested in a specific pattern of brain activity known as the readiness potential. This signal had been identified earlier and was known to appear in motor areas of the brain shortly before voluntary movement. What Libet wanted to know was how the timing of this signal related to the person's conscious experience of deciding to act. To measure that experience, participants were asked to watch a clock with a rapidly moving dot and report the moment they first became aware of the urge or intention to move. By comparing this reported time with the onset of the readiness potential and the actual movement, Libet hoped to map out the temporal sequence of decision-making. The results were striking. On average, the readiness potential began several hundred milliseconds before participants reported becoming consciously aware of their intention to move. In other words, measurable brain activity associated with preparing the movement appeared before the person felt they had decided to act. For many observers, this seemed like a direct challenge to free will. If the brain starts preparing an action before conscious intention appears, then what is consciousness doing? Is it merely observing decisions after they've already been set in motion? These questions spread quickly beyond neuroscience. Philosophers debated their implications. Popular science books presented them as evidence that free will was an illusion. Media summaries often simplified the findings into a dramatic headline: "Your brain decides before you do." But this framing glossed over important details. To understand what Libet's experiment actually showed, it's necessary to look carefully at what kind of decision was being studied and what the measurements could and could not tell us. First, the task itself was deliberately minimal. Participants were not choosing between meaningful alternatives. They were not weighing consequences or considering values. They were instructed to make a spontaneous movement at a time of their choosing without planning. This kind of task is useful for studying timing, but it does not resemble most decisions people care about when they talk about free will. Second, the readiness potential itself is not a decision signal in the ordinary sense. It reflects a gradual increase in neural activity related to motor preparation, not a clear moment of commitment. It does not indicate that a specific action has been irreversibly selected. It indicates that the system is entering a state of readiness. Later research showed that readiness potentials can appear even when a movement does not ultimately occur. In some cases, the brain wraps up preparation and then aborts the action. This suggests that early neural activity does not guarantee a decision. It reflects a bias or tendency, not a final outcome. Third, the timing of conscious awareness in Libet's experiment relied on subjective reports. Participants had to recall when they first felt the urge to move and map that feeling onto a moving clock. This is a delicate measurement. Human introspection is not precise to the millisecond, and memory can distort timing. Libet himself acknowledged these limitations. Importantly, Libet did not conclude that free will was an illusion. In fact, he proposed something quite different. He suggested that while the brain may initiate actions unconsciously, conscious awareness might still play a role in controlling them. Specifically, he introduced the idea of a veto. According to Libet, even if an action begins unconsciously, consciousness may still have the ability to stop it before it is carried out. In his experiments, there was a small window of time between the reported awareness of intention and the actual movement. Libet argued that this window could allow conscious intervention, a chance to withhold or cancel the action. This idea of veto power became an important part of the discussion. It reframed free will not as the initiation of action, but as the ability to regulate and inhibit behavior. You might not choose which impulses arise, but you might choose which ones you allow to become actions. Critics were quick to respond. Some argued that vetoing is itself a decision, and therefore subject to the same unconscious processes. If the brain prepares the veto before awareness as well, then consciousness still appears to be late to the process. Others questioned whether the veto window was large or reliable enough to support meaningful control. Supporters countered that this critique sets an unrealistic standard. If every aspect of control must be conscious from start to finish, to count as free will, then almost no human behavior would qualify. Control in biological systems is distributed and layered. Conscious processes do not need to be first to be effective. Over time, replications and extensions of Libet's work added nuance. Some studies confirmed the general timing pattern. Others found variations depending on task design, instructions, and analysis methods. More sophisticated experiments using brain imaging and machine learning were able to predict simple choices seconds before conscious reports, but again, these were limited low-stakes decisions. What became increasingly clear was that Libet's experiment did not settle the free will debate. Instead, it clarified a specific point. Conscious awareness is not the earliest detectable stage of decision-related brain activity. That finding is important, but it does not by itself tell us whether free will exists or what form it might take. One reason the experiment had such a strong impact is that it conflicted with a deeply ingrained intuition. People tend to think of conscious intention as the starting point of action. Libet showed that this intuition does not align perfectly with neural timing. The brain is already moving before the feeling of deciding appears. But this does not mean the feeling is meaningless. It means it is part of a longer process. Conscious intention may mark a transition from preparation to commitment, or from background processing to explicit control. It may be where reasons, values, and long-term goals are brought to bear. Another important point often missed in popular discussions is that the readiness potential itself is not specific. It does not encode which action will be taken, only that some action is becoming more likely. Later stages of processing determine the final outcome. Conscious awareness may influence those later stages. The legacy of Libet's experiment, then, is not a simple verdict against free will. It is a challenge to a particular picture of free will, one where a conscious self issues commands in isolation from the rest of the brain. That picture is increasingly hard to defend, not just because of Libet, but because of everything we know about how cognition works. Modern views tend to see decision-making as a distributed process. Different systems contribute at different times. Some are fast and automatic, others are slow and reflective. Conscious awareness is part of this system, not its ruler, but not its bystander either. Libet's work forced researchers to be more precise. Instead of asking whether free will exists in an all-or-nothing sense, they began asking what kinds of control humans actually have, when that control is exercised, and under what conditions it is strongest or weakest. In that sense, the experiment was less a demolition and more a redirection. It moved the conversation away from metaphysical origins and toward functional roles. What matters is not whether consciousness fires the first neural signal, but whether it contributes to shaping behavior in ways that align with goals, reasons, and social expectations. As research continued, new questions emerged. If early brain activity biases decisions, how flexible are those biases? Can awareness override them reliably? And how do these processes scale up from simple movements to complex choices involving planning, ethics, and identity? These questions lead naturally to the next step in the discussion. If the brain begins preparing actions before conscious awareness, does that mean the brain is the real decision-maker and the self is merely along for the ride? Or does that distinction misunderstand what the self actually is in biological terms? Once the results of the Libet experiment entered public discussion, they were often distilled into a single unsettling question. Does the brain decide before you do? It sounds straightforward, but hidden inside that question is an assumption that deserves careful attention. It assumes that the brain and you are two separate entities, one acting behind the scenes and the other watching events unfold. Neuroscience does not support that picture, yet the language we use makes it tempting to think this way. When people hear that the brain initiates activity before conscious awareness, it can feel as though something important has been taken away. The sense of being an active author of one's actions seems threatened. But to understand what these findings actually mean, we need to slow down and examine what is meant by the brain, what is meant by you, and why separating them so sharply creates confusion rather than clarity. The brain is not an external machine operating independently of the person. It is the physical system that makes perception, memory, emotion, and thought possible in the first place. Every intention you have, every preference you hold, every doubt you experience is implemented in neural activity. Saying that the brain decides before you do can be misleading, because there is no decision-making self outside the brain waiting to step in. What the experiments really show is that not all decision-related processes are conscious. Some processes begin before awareness, others occur during awareness. Still others continue afterward, shaping future behaviour. Consciousness is not the starting line for all mental activity. It is one layer in a complex system. To see why this matters, consider how the feeling of deciding usually works. From the inside, it feels as though awareness appears, options are considered, and then a choice is made. But this is a retrospective story, constructed after the fact. It compresses many overlapping processes into a neat sequence. The brain, by contrast, operates continuously. There is no clean boundary where non-decision suddenly becomes decision. Neural activity ramps up gradually. Some patterns become stronger, others weaken. The system shifts toward one outcome, but that shift can still be influenced, slowed, or reversed. Conscious awareness often appears when this process reaches a certain threshold, when information becomes relevant to planning, explanation, or control. This means that when awareness appears, the process is already underway, but not necessarily complete. The decision is not finished just because it has begun. The idea that the brain decides before you do only makes sense if you assume that deciding must be a single, instantaneous event. Neuroscience suggests otherwise. Another important point is that early neural signals are probabilistic, not deterministic. They reflect tendencies, biases, and readiness, not fixed outcomes. When researchers predict decisions from brain activity, they are not reading a final verdict. They're identifying statistical patterns that make one outcome more likely than another. In many experiments, prediction accuracy is modest, better than chance, but far from perfect. This alone tells us that early activity does not lock decisions in place. It nudges them. It creates momentum. But momentum can be redirected. This flexibility is crucial. If early brain activity truly decided everything, then hesitation, reconsideration, and self-control would be impossible. Yet these experiences are common. People routinely stop themselves, change course, or override impulses. These adjustments happen because the decision process remains open to influence, including influence from conscious reflection. The confusion often arises because people expect free will to operate at the very first moment of neural activity. But why should it? We do not expect conscious control to govern every heartbeat or reflex. We accept that many processes operate automatically, yet we still consider ourselves agents. Agency in a biological system does not require conscious initiation at the smallest timescale. It requires the ability to shape behavior over time. It requires learning, planning, error correction, and responsiveness to reasons. These capacities depend on interactions between conscious and unconscious processes, not on their separation. It is also important to recognize that the tasks used in experiments like Libet's are intentionally stripped of meaning. Participants are asked to move arbitrarily, without purpose or consequence. This design is useful for measuring timing, but it removes many of the features that make real-life decisions feel like choices. In everyday decisions, you care about outcomes. You have preferences, values, and goals. You think about consequences. These factors recruit different brain systems and unfold over longer periods. Conscious awareness plays a much larger role in these situations, not because it suddenly becomes the sole cause, but because it integrates information across time. When people worry that neuroscience has shown free will to be an illusion, they're often imagining a very specific model of free will. In that model, a conscious self surveys options and then issues a command that initiates action. If that command is not the first cause, the model collapses. But that model was always questionable. Even introspection suggests that many decisions arise gradually. You don't always know exactly when you decided. Sometimes the decision becomes clear only after you act. Other times, you feel torn for a long time, with no single moment of resolution. The brain before you framing also overlooks the fact that consciousness itself is a brain process. Awareness is not an external observer. It is an emergent feature of neural activity, shaped by attention, memory, and context. When awareness influences decisions, it does so by altering neural dynamics, not by bypassing them. This leads to a more realistic picture. The brain is constantly generating potential actions. Conscious awareness highlights some of them, evaluates them, and suppresses others. It does not create options from nothing, but it helps determine which options are taken seriously and which are discarded. In this picture, asking whether the brain decides before you do becomes less useful. A better question is how different parts of the system contribute at different times. Fast processes handle routine preparation. Slower processes handle evaluation and control. Both are part of the same agent. Another source of confusion comes from language. We often speak as though you are identical with conscious thought. When we say, "I decided," we usually mean, "I became aware of deciding." But awareness is only part of the self. Habits, skills, emotional patterns, and long-term dispositions are also part of who you are, even when you are not thinking about them. If a skilled driver swerves to avoid an obstacle before consciously recognizing it, we do not say the action was not theirs. We say they reacted instinctively, drawing on experience. The fact that awareness lagged behind does not strip the action of agency. Similarly, when the brain prepares an action before awareness, it is drawing on the person's history, goals, and tendencies. Those influences are not foreign intruders. They are the accumulated structure of the self. The real concern, then, is not whether unconscious processes exist. They clearly do. The concern is whether conscious reflection can make a difference. Can it alter outcomes in meaningful ways, or is it merely decorative? Evidence suggests that conscious reflection does make a difference, especially over longer timescales. People can train themselves to respond differently. They can develop habits that align with values. They can anticipate situations and plan responses in advance. All of these involve conscious thought influencing future automatic processes. This kind of influence is easy to miss if you focus only on the instant of action. But agency is not confined to instants. It unfolds across time. A decision made today can shape behavior tomorrow by altering expectations, priorities, and emotional responses. Seen this way, free will is less about moment-to-moment initiation and more about self-shaping. It is about the capacity to reflect, learn, and adjust patterns of behavior. The brain's early preparation does not negate this capacity. It is part of how it is implemented. That does not mean all actions are equally free. When someone is exhausted, stressed, or under threat, the balance shifts. Automatic processes dominate. Awareness has less influence. Choices feel narrower. Control is reduced. This is why we intuitively judge such situations differently. Understanding that the brain begins preparing before awareness helps explain these variations. It shows why conditions matter. It also shows why strengthening attention, rest, and emotional regulation can increase effective control. So does the brain decide before you do? If that question means, does neural activity precede conscious awareness? Then yes, that much is clear. But if it means, are you excluded from the decision-making process? Then the answer is no. You are the process. Awareness is one part of it, not the whole. The challenge is letting go of an outdated picture of the self without abandoning the idea of agency altogether. Neuroscience does not force us to choose between total freedom and total illusion. It invites us to rethink what freedom actually involves. As we continue, this will become even more important. The next step is to look at a worldview that takes causation seriously at every level, a view in which every event has a cause and nothing happens by accident. That view is often seen as the greatest threat to free will, but it may also offer a way to understand it more clearly. To understand why determinism has such a strong hold on the free will debate, it helps to start with the picture it paints of the universe. Determinism is the idea that every event has a cause, and that given the complete state of the world at one moment, along with the laws of nature, only one future is possible. Nothing happens without a reason. Nothing appears from nowhere. The universe, on this view, unfolds according to rules that leave no room for deviation. This idea did not begin as a threat to human freedom. In fact, it emerged as one of science's greatest successes. When thinkers began to realize that natural phenomena followed regular, discoverable laws, the world became more understandable and more predictable. Motion, gravity, and mechanics could be described mathematically. Effects followed causes reliably. Nature stopped looking like a collection of whims and started looking like a system. No one embodied this vision more clearly than Isaac Newton. Newton's laws of motion and gravity suggested a universe that behaved like an intricate machine. If you knew the position and velocity of every particle, you could, at least in principle, calculate the future and reconstruct the past. The universe became something like a vast clockwork, ticking forward with perfect regularity. This image was later pushed to its logical extreme by philosophers who imagined an all-knowing intelligence, sometimes called Laplace's demon, that could predict the entire future if it had complete information about the present. In such a universe, there is no genuine branching of possibilities. What happens next is fixed, even if no one knows what it will be. At first, this picture applied mainly to physical objects. Planets orbit, stones fall, machines behave predictably. Humans were often treated as special cases, exceptions to the rule, but as biology, psychology, and neuroscience developed, human behavior increasingly appeared to follow patterns as well. Desires had causes, habits formed through repetition, emotions responded to stimuli. The more we learned, the more the clockwork seemed to include us too. This is where determinism begins to feel uncomfortable. If your thoughts and actions are the result of prior states of the brain, shaped by genetics and experience, then in what sense could you have done otherwise? If the state of the universe a moment ago already contained everything needed to produce your current decision, where does freedom fit? It's important to notice how strong this intuition is. Determinism doesn't just say that behavior is influenced. It says that, given the exact same conditions, the same outcome must occur. No wiggle room, no alternative paths. This clashes directly with the everyday sense that decisions are open, that the future is not yet settled. But there is a subtle shift that often happens here without being noticed. People move from the claim that actions have causes to the claim that actions are therefore not free. That move is not automatic. It depends on what you think freedom requires. If freedom requires actions to be uncaused, then determinism rules it out immediately. But uncaused actions raise their own problems. An action that is not caused by anything, not by reasons, desires, or values, would be arbitrary. It would not reflect who you are. It would not be under control. In that sense, determinism threatens free will only if free will is defined in a very particular way. Still, determinism has an emotional impact that goes beyond definitions. It can feel as though it drains life of possibility. If everything is fixed, then choice starts to feel like a performance rather than a power. You deliberate, you struggle, you decide, but the outcome was already locked in before you began. This feeling is understandable, but it rests on a misleading picture of how determinism works. Determinism does not mean that deliberation is pointless. Deliberation is itself part of the causal chain. When you weigh reasons, imagine consequences, and reflect on values, those processes shape what happens next. The fact that they have causes does not make them irrelevant. It makes them effective. Think of it this way. In a deterministic universe, outcomes depend on what happens in between. If you had not deliberated, a different outcome would have occurred. The reason the outcome is what it is includes the fact that you thought about it. The future depends on the present, and the present includes mental activity. The confusion often comes from imagining determinism as something that bypasses the person, as if causes flow around you rather than through you. But your thoughts, emotions, and reasoning are not outside the causal structure. They are part of it. When they change, outcomes change. This is why determinism does not imply passivity. You still need to act for things to happen. You still need to learn for behavior to change. The causal story includes effort, reflection, and planning. Removing these would produce a different future. Another source of discomfort is the idea of inevitability. If an action was inevitable, it can feel as though it wasn't really chosen. But inevitability here means something very specific. It means that given the exact same conditions, the same outcome would occur. It does not mean that the outcome occurred regardless of what you did. What you did was part of the conditions. This distinction matters. It is one thing to say, this had to happen no matter what. It is another to say, this happened because of what occurred, including your reasoning and decisions. Determinism supports the second claim, not the first. There is also a tendency to confuse determinism with predictability. In theory, a deterministic system is predictable if you have enough information. In practice, complex systems like brains are extraordinarily difficult to predict. Small differences in initial conditions can lead to large differences in outcome. This does not make the system indeterministic, but it does mean that the future is effectively open from our perspective. From the inside, this openness is what matters. You do not experience the future as fixed. You experience it as something you can influence. That experience is grounded in reality, because your actions do influence what happens next. Determinism does not deny this. It explains how it works. The real challenge determinism poses is to a certain kind of ultimate responsibility. If everything you do is the result of factors you did not choose, like your genes and early environment, then how can you be responsible in the deepest sense? This question has fueled centuries of debate. But here again, responsibility in human life is not about ultimate origins. It is about responsiveness. We hold people responsible because they can understand reasons, anticipate consequences, and adjust behavior. These capacities exist within a causal framework. They do not float above it. In fact, determinism may be what makes responsibility possible. If actions were random, there would be nothing to respond to. No pattern to correct. No behavior to guide. Cause and effect allow learning. Learning allows improvement. Improvement allows meaningful accountability. Determinism also explains why changing conditions can change behavior. Education, therapy, incentives, and social norms all work because they enter the causal chain. They do not override determinism, they rely on it. None of this means that determinism settles the free will question. It reframes it. Instead of asking whether we are exempt from causation, we are forced to ask what kinds of causation support agency and what kinds undermine it. Coercion, manipulation, and compulsion undermine agency because they bypass a person's capacity to respond to reasons. Ordinary causation does not. The difference is not whether causes exist, but how they operate. As neuroscience continues to map the causes of behavior, determinism becomes harder to avoid. But that does not mean freedom evaporates. It means freedom must be understood in a way that fits the world we actually inhabit, not one that requires exceptions to natural law. This brings us to an important crossroads. If determinism rules out one version of free will, and randomness cannot replace it without creating new problems, then something else must be going on. The next step is to look at why chance, unpredictability, and randomness do not provide the kind of freedom people are usually hoping for, even though they might seem, at first glance, like an escape from the clockwork universe. When determinism begins to feel suffocating, randomness often appears as a tempting escape. If every event is not strictly caused by what came before, then perhaps there is room for freedom after all. Maybe unpredictability is what saves free will. Maybe if the universe is not a perfect clockwork, then choices can break free from inevitability. This idea shows up frequently in discussions of physics, especially when people point to quantum uncertainty as a possible opening. At first glance, this seems promising. If events are not fully determined, then the future is not fixed. Multiple outcomes are genuinely possible. Something new can happen. That sounds like freedom. But when we slow down and examine what randomness actually means, it becomes clear that it does not give us what we are looking for. Randomness, in its pure form, is the absence of control. A random event is one that is not guided by reasons, intentions, or goals. It does not happen because it makes sense or because it reflects values. It happens because of chance. And while chance can introduce unpredictability, unpredictability alone is not the same as agency. Imagine that every time you faced a decision, the outcome was determined by a random process. Sometimes you help, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you speak kindly, sometimes harshly, with no pattern or reason. From the outside, this might look like freedom from constraint. From the inside, it would feel chaotic and alien. You would not recognize yourself in your actions. They would not express who you are. This highlights a crucial point. Freedom, as people care about it, is not about being unpredictable. It is about being in control in a meaningful way. Control requires stability. It requires that actions follow from preferences, beliefs, and understanding. Randomness disrupts that connection. This is why appealing to randomness as a solution often backfires. If determinism threatens free will by making actions inevitable, randomness threatens it by making actions arbitrary. Neither extreme captures what it feels like to choose. The problem becomes clearer when we think about responsibility. Suppose someone causes harm, and we learn that their action was the result of a random neural fluctuation. Would that make them more responsible? Most people would say no. In fact, it would likely reduce responsibility, because the action did not reflect the person's character or intentions. Responsibility depends on reasons. We ask why someone did something. We expect answers that make sense in terms of beliefs and motivations. Randomness short-circuits this process. It replaces explanation with accident. This is why randomness does not rescue free will from determinism. It removes necessity, but it also removes agency. The challenge is not to escape causation, but to understand which kinds of causation support meaningful choice. Some people turn to quantum mechanics at this point, hoping it might provide a deeper kind of indeterminacy. At very small scales, certain events appear to be fundamentally probabilistic. Outcomes cannot be predicted with certainty, only with likelihoods. This has led to speculation that quantum randomness might be amplified in the brain, introducing genuine indeterminacy into decision-making. Even if this were true, it would not automatically help. If a quantum event tips a decision one way or another, that event is still not guided by reasons. It is not responsive to values. It does not care what you want or what you believe. It is simply noise entering the system. Adding noise to a process does not make it free. It makes it less reliable. In engineering, noise is something to be minimized, not celebrated. In biological systems, excessive randomness leads to dysfunction, not flexibility. The brain, in fact, works hard to suppress randomness. Neural activity is noisy at the microscopic level, but large-scale brain function depends on stable patterns. Learning involves reducing variability, not increasing it. Skills improve as actions become more predictable and controlled. This is true whether you're learning to speak, drive, or regulate emotion. From this perspective, randomness is something the brain manages, not something it relies on for agency. Too much randomness would undermine coherent behavior. Too little flexibility would make adaptation difficult. Effective decision-making sits between these extremes. There is another subtle issue here. People often conflate unpredictability with openness. If a choice is unpredictable, it feels open. But openness, in the sense relevant to free will, is not about surprise. It is about sensitivity to reasons. A system is open in a meaningful way if it can respond differently under different considerations. If new information arrives, the outcome can change. If priorities shift, behavior adjusts. This kind of openness does not require randomness. It requires conditionality. It requires that outcomes depend on reasons. Deterministic systems can be open in this sense. A thermostat responds differently depending on temperature. A chess program responds differently depending on the board position. Human beings respond differently depending on beliefs, desires, and context. These responses are law-governed, but they are not fixed regardless of input. Randomness, by contrast, does not increase responsiveness. It introduces variation that is not tied to meaning. A random deviation does not reflect better understanding or deeper reflection. It just reflects chance. This is why randomness feels wrong as a foundation for freedom. It does not explain why a decision was yours. It explains why it was arbitrary. When people say they want free will, they usually want their actions to make sense. They want them to reflect who they are. They want to see themselves in what they do. Randomness erodes that connection. There is also a practical dimension. If behavior was significantly random, planning would be impossible. Long-term goals would dissolve. Trust would erode. You could not rely on yourself or others to act consistently. The very things that make agency meaningful would fall apart. So we find ourselves in a tight space. Determinism threatens free will by making outcomes inevitable. Randomness threatens it by making outcomes meaningless. If freedom is to be found, it must lie somewhere else. This realization marks an important turning point in the discussion. It forces us to abandon the idea that freedom requires either complete independence from causation or pure unpredictability. Both ideas misunderstand what control actually involves. Control is not about escaping causes. It is about being the right kind of cause. A cause that operates through understanding, reflection, and sensitivity to reasons. A cause that can learn and adjust. A cause that is responsive rather than rigid. This brings us to a position that has gained increasing attention over time. Instead of asking whether free will exists in opposition to determinism, it asks whether freedom can be compatible with a causal universe. It shifts the question from metaphysics to function. The next step is to explore that possibility directly, to look at how some philosophers and scientists have argued that free will does not require breaking the laws of nature, but can exist precisely because of how complex reason-responsive systems like human minds operate within those laws. When the debate over free will reaches the point where both determinism and randomness have been set aside as unsatisfying extremes, a different approach begins to make sense. Instead of asking whether free will can survive causation, this approach asks whether freedom was ever meant to oppose causation in the first place. This is where compatibilism enters the picture, not as a clever compromise, but as a redefinition of what freedom actually involves. Compatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are not enemies. They can coexist. According to this perspective, the fact that actions have causes does not undermine freedom. In fact, it may be what makes freedom possible. This idea can feel counterintuitive at first, especially if you've been taught to think of freedom as independence from influence. But compatibilism begins by questioning that assumption. The core compatibilist insight is simple. Freedom is not about whether your actions have causes. It is about whether your actions flow from you in the right way. The focus shifts from origins to ownership. A decision is free if it arises from your beliefs, values, preferences, and reasoning, rather than from external coercion or internal compulsion that bypasses those capacities. This might sound like a subtle change, but it has significant consequences. Under this view, the question, could you have done otherwise, is not about metaphysical possibility under identical conditions. It is about whether you would have acted differently if your reasons, desires, or understanding had been different. That kind of conditional flexibility is enough for responsibility in real life. Compatibilism takes seriously the fact that human beings are complex systems. We are capable of learning, planning, reflecting, and adjusting behavior over time. These abilities depend on causal processes in the brain. Remove causation, and these abilities disappear. What compatibilism rejects is the idea that causation automatically equals constraint. To see why this matters, consider how we already distinguish between free and unfree actions in everyday life. If someone acts because they were threatened, drugged, or physically forced, we say their action was not free, not because it had a cause, but because the cause bypassed their capacity to respond to reasons. By contrast, when someone acts after thinking, weighing options, and deciding based on what they care about, we treat that action as free, even though it clearly had causes. Compatibilism formalizes this everyday intuition. It says that freedom consists in acting according to one's reasons, without coercion, and with sufficient understanding. The presence of causes does not negate this. It enables it. One of the most influential modern defenders of this view is Daniel Dennett, who argues that the kind of free will worth wanting is not a magical power to step outside the universe, but a set of capacities that evolved because they are useful. The ability to anticipate consequences, consider alternatives, learn from mistakes, and regulate behavior is what allows humans to navigate complex environments. That is freedom in a meaningful, practical sense. From this perspective, the demand that free will require ultimate independence from the past begins to look misplaced. No real system, biological or artificial, works that way. Even systems we clearly consider agents, such as other people, depend on stable causal patterns. If actions were not connected to character and reasoning, there would be nothing to hold accountable. Compatibilism also reframes the threat posed by neuroscience. If the brain prepares actions before awareness that does not eliminate freedom, it shows how freedom is implemented. The relevant question is not whether neural activity precedes awareness, but whether the system as a whole is capable of rational control. Rational control does not mean perfect self-command. It means the ability to respond to reasons over time. It means that when you are given information, you can update beliefs. When you encounter consequences, you can adjust behavior. When you reflect on values, you can shape future decisions. These capacities are not always present to the same degree. They can be impaired by stress, fatigue, illness, addiction, or coercion. Compatibilism takes this seriously. It allows for degrees of freedom rather than treating it as all or nothing. This is one of its strengths. Instead of drawing a sharp line between free and unfree, it explains why responsibility is context-sensitive. A person acting under extreme duress is less free than someone acting calmly and knowingly. A child is less free than an adult. A person with impaired self-control is less free than someone with intact regulation. These judgments reflect real differences in cognitive capacity, not metaphysical status. Another important feature of compatibilism is that it preserves the link between freedom and social practices. Responsibility, praise, blame, and moral evaluation are not abstract concepts floating above human life. They are tools for shaping behavior. They work by appealing to people's ability to understand reasons and care about outcomes. If determinism made all of this meaningless, these practices would collapse, but they do not. They continue to function precisely because people are responsive to reasons. Knowing that actions have causes does not stop people from caring about what they do. If anything, understanding causes can improve how we assign responsibility by making us more precise about when control is present and when it is not. Critics of compatibilism often accuse it of changing the subject. They argue that it gives up on real free will and replaces it with something weaker. But this criticism depends on a very specific and arguably unrealistic idea of what real free will should be. It assumes that freedom must involve being the ultimate origin of one's self, untouched by biology or history. Compatibilists respond that this idea was never coherent to begin with. No human being chose their genes, their early environment, or the basic structure of their brain. If freedom required total self-creation, no one would have it. But that standard does not reflect how freedom actually operates, or why it matters. What matters is whether you can guide your behavior in light of what you understand and care about, whether you can recognize reasons and act on them, whether you can reflect and change. These are the features that make agency meaningful. Compatibilism does not deny that the universe is causal, it embraces it. It argues that causation is not the enemy of freedom, but its medium. Without reliable causal connections, there would be no learning, no planning, no self-control, and no responsibility. This does not mean that all is settled. There are still hard questions about how much control people have in different circumstances, and about how social systems should respond when control is impaired. Compatibilism does not eliminate these debates, it gives them a clearer framework. By redefining freedom in terms of function rather than metaphysics, compatibilism shifts the focus of the free will debate. Instead of asking whether humans are exceptions to nature, it asks what kinds of natural systems can support meaningful agency. As we move forward, this perspective will become increasingly relevant. The next step is to look more closely at what this kind of freedom actually consists of in practice. Not as an abstract idea, but as a set of capacities that allow people to guide their behavior, take responsibility, and act in ways that reflect who they are. When discussions of free will begin to move away from metaphysics and toward how humans actually function, something important becomes clearer. The kind of freedom people rely on in everyday life has very little to do with magic. It does not depend on decisions appearing from nowhere or on the self floating above biology. It depends on control, not perfect control, not total command, but enough control to guide behavior in ways that reflect understanding, priorities, and long-term goals. Control in this sense is not a single ability. It is a collection of capacities that work together. The ability to focus attention, the ability to hold information in mind, the ability to imagine outcomes, the ability to inhibit impulses, the ability to learn from feedback. None of these capacities operate in isolation, and none of them require exemption from causation. They require reliable mechanisms that can coordinate action over time. When people say they acted of their own free will, they usually mean that they were not forced, not manipulated, and not acting blindly. They mean that the action made sense to them at the time, given what they believed and wanted. This sense of ownership does not require that the decision lacked causes. It requires that the causes ran through the person's deliberative and self-regulating systems. This is why control is a more useful concept than freedom understood as metaphysical independence. Control is something that can be studied, strengthened, weakened, and disrupted. It varies across individuals and situations. It can be trained, it can fail, and its failures are recognizable in everyday life. Consider impulse control. When someone resists an urge, what is happening is not the creation of a new desire out of thin air. It is the activation of regulatory systems that suppress one response in favor of another. These systems rely on past learning, expectations about the future, and an understanding of consequences. When they work well, actions feel deliberate. When they're overwhelmed, actions feel automatic or regretted. Importantly, impulse control does not eliminate desire. It modulates it. The desire remains present, but it does not dictate behavior. This modulation is one of the clearest expressions of control, and it does not require that the desire itself was freely chosen. It requires that the system can manage competing signals. This kind of control is deeply dependent on conditions. Sleep deprivation reduces it, stress reduces it, alcohol reduces it, certain neurological conditions reduce it. When control weakens, freedom narrows. People intuitively recognize this. We do not judge actions the same way when someone is exhausted, intoxicated, or under extreme pressure. This sensitivity to conditions is not a flaw in the concept of free will. It is evidence that free will, understood as control, is grounded in biology. It rises and falls with the brain's capacity to regulate itself. Another aspect of control is foresight. The ability to imagine future outcomes allows decisions to be guided by more than immediate reward. This capacity develops gradually in childhood and continues to mature into early adulthood. It depends on brain systems that integrate memory, emotion, and prediction. When foresight is limited, choices become short-sighted. This does not mean there is no agency, but it means agency is constrained. Someone who cannot reliably anticipate consequences cannot guide behavior in the same way as someone who can. Again, this aligns with how responsibility is assigned in practice. Control also involves flexibility. A controlled system is not one that rigidly follows rules regardless of context. It is one that can adjust when circumstances change. Flexibility allows a person to revise plans, reconsider beliefs, and respond to new information. This capacity depends on feedback loops that compare expected outcomes with actual outcomes and update behavior accordingly. From this perspective, freedom looks less like a moment of pure choice and more like a pattern over time. A person who consistently responds to reasons, learns from mistakes, and adjusts behavior exhibits more agency than someone whose actions are rigid, compulsive, or chaotic. This view also explains why habits play such a central role in freedom. Habits are often seen as the opposite of free will, but in reality, they are one of its foundations. Habits reduce cognitive load, allowing attention and reflection to be reserved for novel or important situations. A person with well-formed habits can act effectively without constant deliberation. Of course, habits can also become problematic when they are misaligned with goals. In those cases, control involves reshaping habits, not eliminating them. This process often requires conscious effort, repetition, and environmental support. It is slow, but it demonstrates agency operating across time rather than a single instant. The idea of free will as control also clarifies why randomness is unhelpful. Random variation does not enhance control, it undermines it. A system that behaves unpredictably for no reason is not more free, it is less reliable. Control depends on stability combined with adaptability, not on chance. This framework also helps explain why increasing understanding can increase freedom. When you understand the factors that influence your behavior, you gain leverage. You can anticipate triggers, restructure environments, and plan responses. This is not escaping causation, it is using it. For example, someone who knows they are easily distracted may choose to remove distractions when working. Someone who knows they are prone to emotional reactions may pause before responding. These adjustments increase control by shaping conditions. They are expressions of agency, even though they rely on causal insight. This is why the idea that neuroscience undermines free will often misses the point. Understanding how the brain works does not remove control. It reveals where control comes from and how it can be supported. Knowledge becomes a tool for agency, not a threat to it. Another advantage of viewing free will as control is that it allows for meaningful distinctions between different kinds of influence. Influence that operates through persuasion and reason preserves agency. Influence that operates through manipulation or coercion undermines it. The difference lies not in whether causes are present, but in whether the person's reasoning capacities are engaged. Advertising, social pressure, and cultural norms all influence behavior, but they do so in different ways. Some influences can be resisted through reflection. Others are designed to bypass awareness. Understanding this difference is crucial for evaluating responsibility in a complex social world. Free will as control also aligns with how moral responsibility functions. Responsibility is not about being an uncaused cause, It is about being a responsive agent. Someone is responsible when they can understand norms, recognize reasons, and adjust behavior accordingly. When those capacities are absent or impaired, responsibility is reduced. This does not mean that people are always in control. It means that control is something to be assessed, not assumed. It invites more nuanced judgments, not blanket conclusions. Seen this way, free will is not something you either have or lack entirely. It is something you exercise to varying degrees, depending on context, capacity, and support. This does not weaken the concept. It makes it usable. By letting go of the idea that freedom must be magical, we gain a clearer view of what actually matters: the ability to guide action, the ability to reflect, the ability to learn, the ability to change. These abilities are not illusions. They are real, measurable, and fragile. They can be strengthened or undermined. They depend on the brain, but they are not reducible to a single neural event. As we move forward, it will be important to examine how conscious awareness fits into this picture more precisely. If free will is about control rather than magic, then what exactly does consciousness contribute to control, and where does its influence begin and end? Conscious awareness is often treated as the centerpiece of free will. When people think about choosing, they picture a conscious mind surveying options and selecting one. Awareness feels like the place where decisions happen. But once we begin looking closely at how the brain works, it becomes clear that awareness does not sit at the center of every decision in the way intuition suggests. Instead, it plays a more specific and more limited role, one that is still crucial, but different from what many people expect. To understand this role, it helps to start by recognizing what conscious awareness actually is. Awareness is not a continuous spotlight illuminating everything the brain is doing. It is selective, slow, and narrow. At any given moment, you are aware of only a tiny fraction of the information being processed. Sensory input, emotional signals, memory activation, and motor preparation are all happening largely outside awareness. Consciousness samples from this activity rather than supervising it in detail. This selectivity is not a weakness, it is a design feature. If you were aware of everything your brain was doing, you would be unable to function. Awareness prioritizes what is relevant for reasoning, communication, and control. It brings certain information into a format that can be reflected on, compared, and used for planning. One of the most important contributions of conscious awareness is that it allows information to be held stable over time. Without awareness, mental states tend to be brief and reactive. With awareness, thoughts can be sustained, revisited, and manipulated. This is what makes deliberation possible. You can think about a future consequence, keep it in mind, and let it influence your current behavior. This ability to maintain information is central to self-control. When you resist an impulse, you're often holding a reason in mind that competes with the impulse. That reason might be a long-term goal, a social rule, or a memory of past consequences. Awareness allows that reason to remain active long enough to affect the decision. Importantly, awareness does not generate reasons out of nothing. The reasons themselves come from learning, values, and experience. But awareness gives them staying power. It allows them to influence ongoing processes rather than being immediately overridden by stronger but shorter-lived signals. Another key role of awareness is integration. Many brain systems process information in parallel, each with its own priorities. Emotional systems evaluate significance. Sensory systems process input. Motor systems prepare action. Awareness provides a shared workspace where information from different systems can be combined. This integration is especially important in complex or novel situations. When routines break down or goals conflict, awareness helps coordinate responses. You may notice a feeling of uncertainty or tension when this happens. That feeling reflects competing signals that require resolution. Awareness allows those signals to be compared rather than acted on blindly. This is why conscious awareness becomes more prominent when decisions are difficult. Easy, well-practiced decisions rely more on automatic processing. Difficult decisions require sustained attention. Awareness ramps up when flexibility is needed. This also explains why awareness often arrives late in simple decisions. In routine actions, there is little need for reflection. The system can act efficiently without conscious involvement. Awareness may appear only when something unexpected happens or when a check is required. Some critics of free will point to this as evidence that awareness is an afterthought. But this misrepresents its function. Awareness is not designed to initiate every action. It is designed to intervene when intervention is useful. There is also the role of monitoring. Awareness allows you to notice what you're doing and evaluate it in real time. This monitoring enables mid-course correction. You can begin an action, realize it is inappropriate, and stop. This kind of control depends on feedback becoming conscious quickly enough to matter. The idea of veto, introduced earlier, fits naturally here. Awareness may not start actions, but it can stop them. This stopping power is not trivial. In many situations, refraining from action is more important than initiating it. The ability to pause, reassess, and inhibit behavior is one of the clearest expressions of control. Another often overlooked role of awareness is learning. Experiences that reach awareness are more likely to be remembered and used to guide future behavior. When you consciously reflect on an outcome, you update expectations, you refine values, you adjust strategies. These changes influence future automatic processing. In this way, awareness shapes the future indirectly. It may not determine the immediate decision, but it alters the conditions under which future decisions are made. Over time, this can have a profound effect on behavior. This temporal dimension is critical. If free will is understood only at the instant of action, awareness can seem weak or late. But if free will is understood across time, awareness becomes central. It is how patterns of behavior are modified, not how impulses are generated. There is also a social dimension to conscious awareness. Awareness allows you to explain your actions to others. You can give reasons, justify decisions, and take responsibility. This ability is not just about communication. It feeds back into self-understanding. When you articulate reasons, you clarify them for yourself. This clarification influences future choices. Social accountability relies heavily on this capacity. When someone knows they will have to explain themselves, they often deliberate more carefully. Awareness of norms and expectations shapes behavior. This does not require freedom from causation. It requires sensitivity to reasons. Another important aspect is that awareness allows for abstraction. You can think in general terms, consider principles, and apply them across situations. Automatic processes are often context-specific. Awareness allows you to step back and recognize patterns. This abstraction is essential for moral reasoning, long-term planning, and identity formation. Identity itself is closely tied to conscious awareness. The sense of being a continuous self across time depends on memory, narrative, and reflection. Awareness stitches together experiences into a coherent story. This story is not perfectly accurate, but it provides stability. It allows you to say, "This is who I am, and this is how I act." That sense of identity feeds back into decision-making. Actions that align with identity feel easier. Actions that conflict with it feel uncomfortable. Awareness plays a role in maintaining and revising that identity over time. This does not mean awareness is always reliable. It can be biased, it can rationalize, it can misinterpret causes. People often overestimate their conscious control and underestimate unconscious influence. But imperfect does not mean irrelevant. One way to think about conscious awareness is as a regulator rather than a generator. It regulates which information matters, which goals are prioritized, and which actions are suppressed or encouraged. It does not operate alone, but it changes the balance. This view also helps explain why impairments to awareness affect freedom. Conditions that disrupt attention, memory, or reflection reduce the ability to guide behavior. Severe distraction narrows awareness. Extreme emotion hijacks it. Certain neurological conditions fragment it. In each case, control weakens. This again aligns with everyday judgments. We excuse behavior when awareness is compromised. We expect more from people who are attentive, informed, and reflective. These expectations are grounded in real differences in capacity. Understanding the role of conscious awareness does not require denying the importance of unconscious processes. It requires recognizing how the two interact. Unconscious systems generate options, biases, and impulses. Awareness selects, integrates, and regulates. The mistake is to imagine awareness as an all-powerful executive or as a powerless observer. It is neither. It is a specialized function within a larger system, one that matters most when flexibility, learning, and self-correction are required. As we continue, this interaction between awareness and automatic processes will become even more important. The next step is to look at how much of our behavior is shaped by forces we rarely notice at all. Forces that operate quietly in the background, shaping choices before they ever reach awareness. Much of what shapes human behavior happens quietly, without announcement and without conscious permission. You wake up and reach for your phone in a familiar way. You take the same route to work. You react to certain people with ease and to others with tension, often before you know why. These patterns do not feel like decisions in the moment, yet they guide a large portion of what you do. If free will is understood as control, then habits, environments, and subtle influences become central to the story rather than side notes. Habits are often misunderstood as the opposite of choice. They are described as mindless routines, actions taken on autopilot. But this framing misses why habits exist and why the brain relies on them so heavily. Habits are learned solutions to repeated problems. They allow behavior to be fast, efficient, and reliable. Without them, even simple tasks would require constant effort. From a biological perspective, habits are not shortcuts around agency. They are one of its main tools. By automating frequent actions, the brain frees up attention and awareness for situations that actually require deliberation. You do not consciously decide how to walk or how to form most words when you speak, yet these actions are clearly yours. They reflect learning, practice, and adaptation over time. The problem arises when habits operate in contexts where flexibility is needed. A habit that works well in one environment may be unhelpful or harmful in another. When this happens, behavior can feel out of sync with intention. You find yourself doing something you did not plan to do, or repeating patterns you wish you could change. This can feel like a loss of control, but it is better understood as a mismatch between learned responses and current goals. Importantly, habits are not fixed. They are maintained by feedback. When outcomes change, habits can weaken and be replaced. This process is often slow and uneven, but it is real. Conscious awareness plays a role here by noticing patterns, identifying triggers, and deliberately restructuring situations. Changing a habit rarely succeeds through willpower alone. It succeeds through altering the conditions that support it. This brings us to the role of environment. Human behavior is deeply sensitive to context. Small changes in surroundings can produce large changes in action. The presence of certain objects, the layout of a space, the timing of cues, and the behavior of others all influence what actions become likely. This influence is not subtle in its effects, but it is subtle in how it is experienced. From the inside, behavior still feels voluntary. You do not feel pushed, you feel inclined. That distinction matters. Influence that operates through inclination does not feel like force, yet it can be powerful. Consider how eating behavior changes depending on portion size, plate size, or food visibility, or how productivity changes depending on noise level, lighting, or digital distractions. In each case, the environment shapes which options are salient and which are ignored. The brain responds to what is present and prominent. This does not mean people are puppets of their environment. It means that control is exercised partly through environment management. People who understand this often design their surroundings intentionally. They remove temptations, create reminders, and structure routines to support desired behavior. These actions are expressions of agency, not admissions of weakness. In fact, ignoring environmental influence often leads to poorer control. People who believe that free will means resisting any influence may place themselves in situations where failure is likely, then blame themselves when habits take over. A more realistic understanding of control recognizes that shaping conditions is part of choosing. Social environment is especially influential. Human beings are deeply responsive to social cues. Approval, disapproval, imitation, and expectation all shape behavior, often without conscious awareness. This responsiveness is not a flaw. It is a feature of social learning. It allows norms to spread and cooperation to function. However, it also means that behavior can shift dramatically depending on who is present. People often act differently alone than in groups, differently among friends than among strangers. These shifts can feel puzzling after the fact. You may ask yourself why you said something you would not normally say. The answer often lies in social context rather than internal inconsistency. Again, this does not eliminate agency. It explains how agency is distributed across situations. A person's control depends not only on internal capacities, but also on social dynamics. Pressure, conformity, and authority can narrow choices. Support, trust, and openness can expand them. There is also the influence of prior learning that never reached awareness. Many preferences and reactions are shaped early in life and reinforced over time. Emotional responses to certain tones of voice, facial expressions, or situations can be triggered automatically. When these responses align with current goals, they feel natural. When they do not, they can feel intrusive. This is especially relevant for fear and avoidance. The brain learns quickly from threat. Once a pattern is established, similar cues can trigger responses long before conscious evaluation occurs. This can make certain choices feel unavailable, even when no external barrier exists. Understanding this helps explain why some people struggle to do things they genuinely want to do. The struggle is not between free will and lack of free will. It is between competing learned patterns, some of which operate faster and more automatically than others. Invisible influence also includes cognitive biases. The brain uses shortcuts to process information efficiently, but these shortcuts can distort judgment. Confirmation bias, availability bias, and framing effects all influence decisions without being experienced as pressure. You still feel like you are reasoning. You just start from a tilted perspective. These biases do not remove agency, but they constrain it. A person who is unaware of them is more likely to be guided by them. A person who understands them can compensate, at least partially. Education, reflection, and feedback can reduce their impact. Again, this is control operating through knowledge rather than denial of influence. One of the most important implications of all this is that freedom is not just about internal willpower. It is about the interaction between mind and world. The same person can appear highly self-controlled in one environment and impulsive in another. The difference is not character, it is context. This realization has practical consequences. It suggests that supporting agency often means changing environments rather than lecturing individuals. It also suggests that moral judgments should take context seriously. When environments systematically undermine control, blaming individuals alone misses the causal structure of behavior. None of this implies that people lack responsibility. It implies that responsibility is shared between individuals and the systems they inhabit. Agency is exercised within constraints, not outside them. From the inside, habits and environmental influences can feel invisible because they do not announce themselves as causes. They feel like preferences, tendencies, or moods. But their invisibility does not make them irrelevant. It makes them powerful. A key feature of mature agency is becoming aware of these influences and learning how to work with them rather than against them. This does not mean eliminating habits or escaping environment. It means using them intentionally. People who develop strong control over their behavior often do so by reducing the number of decisions they need to make. They rely on routines that support their goals. They design environments that reduce friction. They anticipate their own weaknesses and plan around them. These strategies do not look like heroic acts of willpower, but they are effective. Seen this way, free will is less about standing alone against influence and more about navigating influence intelligently. It is about knowing which situations support your values and which undermine them, and acting accordingly. As we move forward, this perspective raises an important question. If so much of behavior is shaped by habit, environment, and unseen forces, what does this mean for how we judge others and ourselves? How should responsibility, blame, and forgiveness be understood in a world where control is real but unevenly distributed? Beliefs about free will do not stay confined to philosophy or neuroscience. They spill outward into everyday judgments, social institutions, and the way people treat one another. Whether or not someone consciously reflects on the concept, assumptions about choice and control quietly shape ideas about responsibility, punishment, praise, forgiveness, and even empathy. In this sense, belief in free will is not just an abstract position, it is a social force. One of the clearest places this shows up is in how people assign blame. When someone causes harm, the first question is often not what happened, but why. Was the action intentional? Was it avoidable? Could the person have acted differently? These questions presuppose some degree of control. The more control we believe a person had, the more blame we assign. The less control we believe they had, the more we look for mitigating factors. This pattern is deeply ingrained. It shows up in everyday disagreements as well as in formal systems of judgment. When someone is seen as acting freely, their actions are treated as expressions of character. When someone is seen as constrained, their actions are treated as outcomes of circumstance. This distinction feels natural, but it depends heavily on how free will is understood. Belief in strong, unconstrained free will tends to push responsibility inward. If people are thought to be fully self-determining, then failures are interpreted as personal flaws. Success becomes a sign of virtue. This can encourage accountability, but it can also harden attitudes. When control is assumed to be equal across individuals, differences in behavior are easily moralized. On the other hand, skepticism about free will can shift attention outward. If actions are seen as products of biology, environment, and experience, then blame softens. People become more interested in causes than in condemnation. This can increase compassion, but it can also raise concerns about moral drift. If no one is truly responsible, why hold anyone accountable at all? Research suggests that these beliefs have measurable effects. When people are experimentally encouraged to think of behavior as fully determined and outside conscious control, they may show reduced willingness to punish, but also reduced motivation to hold themselves to standards. Some studies suggest increases in cheating or passivity under these conditions, though the results are not always consistent. This highlights an important point. Beliefs about free will do not operate in isolation. They interact with existing values, norms, and incentives. Removing the language of responsibility without replacing it with a functional alternative can create confusion rather than clarity. Social systems rely on the idea that behavior can be guided by reasons. Laws, rules, and norms are designed to influence actions by appealing to understanding and self-control. If people are treated as incapable of responding to reasons, these systems lose their leverage. At the same time, rigid belief in absolute free will can justify harsh responses to behavior that is strongly shaped by factors beyond a person's control. Poverty, trauma, mental illness, and early deprivation all influence behavior in ways that are difficult to override. Ignoring these influences can lead to punishment that satisfies a desire for blame but does little to reduce harm. This tension is especially visible in attitudes toward punishment. Some people view punishment primarily as retribution. If someone freely chose to do wrong, then suffering is deserved. Others view punishment as a tool for deterrence, rehabilitation, or protection. These approaches rest on different assumptions about control. If behavior is seen as entirely chosen, punishment becomes a moral response. If behavior is seen as largely caused, punishment becomes a pragmatic one. In practice, most societies mix these approaches, often without resolving the underlying conflict. Beliefs about free will also affect forgiveness. When people believe that harmful actions reflect fixed character, forgiveness becomes harder. When they believe actions reflect circumstances or temporary failures of control, forgiveness becomes more accessible. This does not mean excusing harm, it means interpreting it differently. Forgiveness in this sense depends on the belief that people can change. That belief itself rests on a compatibilist notion of control. If behavior is rigidly determined and unchangeable, forgiveness makes little sense. If behavior is responsive to learning and reflection, forgiveness becomes an investment in future improvement. Social trust is another area where free will beliefs matter. Trust depends on predictability, not randomness. We trust people when we believe their actions are guided by stable reasons and values. This kind of trust aligns poorly with both extreme determinism and pure randomness. It aligns best with a view of agency as reason-responsive control. There is also the issue of self-judgment. Beliefs about free will shape how people relate to their own failures. When individuals believe they had total control, they may experience intense guilt or shame when they fall short. When they believe they had no control, they may experience helplessness. Neither extreme is psychologically healthy. A more balanced view allows for responsibility without cruelty. It allows people to acknowledge mistakes without collapsing into self-condemnation. It also allows for effort without perfectionism. This balance matters not just morally but psychologically. In education and parenting, beliefs about free will influence expectations. Children who are seen as fully responsible for their behavior may be punished rather than guided. Children who are seen as incapable of control may be underestimated. Effective guidance depends on recognizing developing capacities and supporting them. In workplaces, beliefs about control shape management styles. Environments built on trust and support tend to assume that people want to do well and can respond to feedback. Environments built on suspicion tend to assume that people must be forced into compliance. These assumptions often become self-fulfilling. Cultural differences further complicate the picture. Some cultures emphasize individual choice and personal responsibility more strongly than others. In these contexts, belief in free will is closely tied to identity. Questioning it can feel threatening, not because it undermines science, but because it disrupts social narratives about merit and deservingness. None of this means that belief in free will must be defended at all costs. It means that changing how people think about free will has consequences, intended or not. Those consequences depend on what replaces the old beliefs. If skepticism about free will leads to greater attention to social conditions, mental health, and prevention, it can reduce harm. If it leads to fatalism or disengagement, it can undermine agency. The outcome depends on whether control is reinterpreted or abandoned. This is why many researchers argue that the most constructive approach is not to deny free will outright, but to redefine it in functional terms. When freedom is understood as the capacity to respond to reasons, beliefs about causation become less threatening. Responsibility becomes a matter of degree and context, not an all-or-nothing verdict. Such a view supports accountability without blindness to influence. It allows societies to hold people responsible, while still addressing the conditions that shape behavior. It shifts the focus from moral condemnation to behavioral understanding. As this discussion continues, it raises a difficult but necessary question. If beliefs about free will shape how we judge and treat others, What happens when those beliefs change? How should responsibility be understood in a world where control is real, but uneven, and where causes matter without erasing agency? When people hear the claim that free will might be an illusion, the reaction is often immediate and emotional. It sounds like a statement that pulls the floor out from under everyday life. If free will is not real, then what becomes of responsibility, effort, morality, or meaning? Do choices still matter, or are they just the passive unfolding of forces beyond anyone's control? These concerns are not abstract. They touch on how people see themselves and how they relate to others. But before following those fears too far, it is worth slowing down and asking what is actually being claimed when someone says free will is an illusion. In most cases, what is being rejected is not choice itself, but a particular picture of choice. The illusion, if there is one, is usually the idea that decisions originate in a fully independent conscious self that stands outside biology, history, and causation. Losing that picture can feel like losing freedom altogether, but the two are not the same. One immediate worry is moral collapse. If no one truly chooses their actions, then why praise or blame anyone? Why hold people accountable? Why try to be better? These questions assume that moral practices only make sense if people are ultimate originators of themselves. But in practice, moral systems have never depended on that standard. They depend on something more grounded, the ability of people to respond to reasons and to change behavior. If someone acts in a way that causes harm, and that person can understand why the action was wrong and adjust future behavior, then accountability serves a purpose. It signals norms, protects others, and encourages learning. None of this requires that the person created themselves from nothing. It requires that their behavior is sensitive to feedback. If free will were truly an illusion, in the sense that no one could learn, adapt, or respond to reasons, then moral practices would indeed collapse. But that is not the world we inhabit. People do change. They do respond to incentives, explanations, and consequences. These capacities are observable facts, not metaphysical assumptions. Another fear is passivity. If everything is caused, why bother trying? Why make an effort if the outcome is already determined? This reaction treats determinism as if it bypasses effort, rather than incorporating it. In reality, effort is one of the causes that shape outcomes. The fact that effort itself has causes does not make it irrelevant. It makes it effective. People who give up trying because they believe outcomes are fixed are still acting within a causal framework. Their belief becomes part of the cause of their inaction. The system responds accordingly. This is not a revelation about reality. It is a change in strategy. There is also a concern about personal meaning. Many people experience their choices as expressions of who they are. If those choices are reframed as the result of neural processes, does that make life feel hollow? This worry often arises from a misunderstanding of what explanation does. Explaining how something works does not explain it away. Understanding how memory works does not make memories less meaningful. Understanding how love is supported by brain chemistry does not make relationships empty. In the same way, understanding how decisions are generated does not strip them of significance. Meaning comes from patterns, not from mystery. If free will is an illusion, in the narrow sense that conscious awareness is not the sole initiator of action, then much of what people value remains intact. People still care, they still plan, they still struggle, they still form commitments and identities. These phenomena do not vanish when reinterpreted, they become clearer. One of the most constructive consequences of questioning free will is increased compassion. When behavior is seen as shaped by circumstances, history, and biology, it becomes harder to reduce people to single actions. This does not mean excusing harm. It means understanding it in context. This shift can reduce excessive blame and increase focus on prevention and rehabilitation. Instead of asking only who deserves punishment, attention can turn to what conditions produce the behavior and how similar outcomes can be avoided in the future. This is not moral weakness, it is moral pragmatism. At the same time, compassion does not require denying agency altogether. People are still participants in their own behaviour, they still make sense of reasons, they still respond to norms. Seeing behaviour as cause does not mean seeing people as objects. It means seeing them as systems that can change. Another consequence of free will skepticism is humility. Recognizing the role of luck, upbringing, and environment can soften harsh self-judgment and arrogance alike. Success becomes less about personal virtue alone, and more about a combination of effort and circumstance. Failure becomes less about moral defect and more about constraint and misalignment. This humility can be psychologically healthy. It allows people to acknowledge limits without giving up responsibility. It reduces shame without eliminating accountability. It encourages self-improvement without demanding perfection. There are risks, however, if free will skepticism is misunderstood, if it is framed as the idea that nothing matters or that no one has any control, it can undermine motivation. People may disengage or adopt fatalistic attitudes. This is not an inevitable outcome, but it is a possible one. The difference lies in how the concept is presented. If free will is rejected without replacing it with a functional account of control, people are left with a vacuum. Into that vacuum can flow apathy or nihilism. If, instead, free will is reframed as a set of capacities that operate within constraints, agency remains meaningful. Another area affected by free will skepticism is justice. Legal systems are built on assumptions about responsibility. If those assumptions shift, so must the system. Some fear that acknowledging causal influences will lead to leniency that undermines deterrence. Others argue that current systems already overestimate control and punish without addressing root causes. A more nuanced understanding allows for both accountability and reform. It supports consequences that are proportionate and aimed at future behaviour rather than symbolic retribution. It allows mental health, education, and social conditions to be taken seriously without denying personal responsibility. On a personal level, questioning free will can change how people relate to their own thoughts. If urges and impulses are seen as arising automatically, people may stop identifying with every thought they have. This can be liberating. Not every impulse becomes a command. Awareness creates space. This perspective aligns well with many therapeutic approaches. Cognitive and behavioral therapies often emphasize observing thoughts rather than obeying them. Seeing mental events as products of processes rather than expressions of essence can increase flexibility. Importantly, none of this requires believing that free will is entirely illusory. It requires recognizing that control is partial, situated, and variable. The illusion, if there is one, lies in the idea of total self-command. Life does not fall apart when that idea is released. In many cases, it becomes easier to navigate. Expectations become more realistic. Responsibility becomes more targeted. Compassion becomes more natural. Still, it is understandable that the phrase "free will is an illusion" feels threatening. It compresses a complex set of claims into a blunt statement. What matters is not the phrase, but the framework behind it. If free will is defined as magical independence, then yes, it may be an illusion. If free will is defined as the capacity to guide behaviour in light of reasons, then it remains very real, even if it is constrained and imperfect. The real danger is not losing free will. It is misunderstanding what freedom consists of. When freedom is treated as an all-or-nothing metaphysical property, it becomes fragile. When it is treated as a set of capacities that can be supported or undermined, it becomes actionable. As this discussion moves forward, the question shifts again. If the illusion is not freedom itself, but a certain way of thinking about it, then why does the question matter so much? Why does it continue to feel important, even after the extremes are set aside? Even after determinism has been examined, randomness set aside and free will reframed in more practical terms, the question stubbornly remains. Why does this topic refuse to settle? Why does it keep resurfacing in science, philosophy, law, and ordinary conversation? The persistence of the question is not an accident. It matters because it sits at the centre of how humans understand themselves, and changing that understanding changes how people live. At a basic level, the question of free will matters because it shapes how people interpret their own actions. When someone asks whether they truly chose something, they're not only asking about causation, they're asking whether their actions say something meaningful about who they are. Choice is closely tied to identity. It connects behaviour to character, intention, and self-concept. If that connection feels threatened, people feel unsettled. This is why discussions about free will often provoke defensiveness or anxiety. They're not just intellectual exercises, they touch on self-respect. If actions are seen as nothing more than mechanical outcomes, people worry that their lives become interchangeable, that effort loses its personal significance. Even when this worry is based on a misunderstanding, the emotional response is real. The question also matters because it influences how people think about change. Belief in agency is closely tied to belief in improvement. If someone believes they can influence their future behaviour, they are more likely to try. If they believe their behaviour is fixed or meaningless, motivation weakens. This is not a metaphysical issue, it is a psychological one. Importantly, this does not mean that belief in absolute free will is required for motivation. What matters is belief in some degree of control. People need to believe that reflection, effort, and learning can make a difference. When that belief is present, even within a causal framework, people remain engaged. When it disappears, passivity becomes more likely. The question of free will also matters socially, because it affects how people relate to one another. Every time someone excuses, forgives, condemns, or praises, they are making an implicit judgment about control. These judgments influence relationships, institutions, and norms. They shape how societies respond to harm and how they encourage cooperation. If free will is treated as absolute and uniform, social systems tend to become rigid. Punishment becomes moralized. Failure is personalized. Structural causes are ignored. If free will is denied altogether, systems risk becoming paternalistic or disengaged, treating people as problems to be managed rather than agents to be addressed. The balance between these extremes is difficult to maintain, but it matters. A society that understands agency as real but constrained is better positioned to design systems that both hold people accountable and support change. This balance depends on how the free will question is framed. The question also matters because it shapes how people understand fairness. Ideas about merit, desert, and entitlement are closely tied to beliefs about choice. If success is seen as purely chosen, inequality is easier to justify. If success is seen as largely caused by circumstance, redistribution becomes easier to defend. Neither view is complete on its own, but each has political consequences. This is one reason the free will debate often becomes heated when it intersects with discussions about wealth, crime, or social policy. These debates are not just about facts, they're about responsibility and deservingness. How much credit people deserve for outcomes depends on how much control they are believed to have had. At a more personal level, the question matters because it affects how people relate to their own mistakes. When people believe they should have had total control, they may respond to failure with harsh self-blame. When they believe they had no control, they may respond with resignation. Neither response is helpful. A more realistic view allows people to say, I had some control, but not as much as I thought, or I can do better next time if conditions change. This supports learning rather than punishment, effort rather than shame. It encourages responsibility without cruelty. The free will question also matters because it sits at the boundary between explanation and meaning. Science explains how decisions are made. Human beings care about what decisions mean. These are not competing domains, but they can feel that way if explanation is mistaken for erasure. When neuroscience explains the mechanisms of choice, it does not tell you what to value. It does not tell you which goals matter. It tells you how goals are pursued. Confusing these levels leads to unnecessary conflict. Understanding this distinction allows scientific insight to coexist with personal significance. Another reason the question persists is that free will operates at multiple timescales. In the moment, choices may feel constrained by habit or emotion. Over months and years, people clearly reshape their lives. They change careers, relationships, and priorities. Any account of free will that focuses only on instantaneous decisions misses this longer arc. Over time, people influence the very systems that generate their future behavior. They choose environments, develop habits, and adopt values. These changes alter what options feel available later. This is a slow form of agency, but it is powerful. The question of free will matters because it helps people recognize and use this longer-term influence. The question also matters because it guards against simplistic thinking. When free will is treated as obvious and unquestionable, harmful assumptions can hide beneath it. When it is treated as completely illusory, other harmful assumptions rush in. Keeping the question open encourages careful reasoning. It forces distinctions to be made between influence and coercion, between explanation and excuse, between constraint and impossibility. These distinctions are essential for fair judgment, effective policy, and personal growth. There is also a deeper reason the question endures. Human beings experience themselves as deliberating, struggling, and committing. That experience is not easily dismissed, even when it is reinterpreted. The gap between lived experience and scientific description creates tension, and that tension drives inquiry. As long as people experience themselves as agents, the question of agency will matter. Even if future science provides more detailed explanations, the need to integrate those explanations with experience will remain. This is why the free will debate does not end with a single experiment or theory. Each advance clarifies part of the picture, but the whole picture involves biology, psychology, culture, and lived life. No single discipline can close the question on its own. Ultimately, the question still matters because it shapes how people answer a quieter, more personal question. What can I reasonably expect of myself, and what can I reasonably expect of others? That question cannot be answered without some view of control. As we move toward the end of this discussion, the focus shifts once more. After examining causes, constraints, beliefs, and consequences, what remains is not a verdict, but a way of living with the question. How people act when they treat choice as meaningful, even in a causal world, may matter more than whether the question is ever finally resolved. Living as if choice matters does not require believing that every decision is made in perfect freedom or that conscious intention is the sole cause of action. It requires something more modest and more practical. It requires treating human behavior as responsive, influenceable, and capable of change. In other words, it requires acting as though what you do can shape what happens next, even if that shaping occurs within constraints you did not choose. In everyday life, people already operate this way, often without noticing it. They plan, they set goals, they make commitments, and they revise those commitments when they fail. They learn from experience, they try again. None of this depends on metaphysical certainty. It depends on the expectation that effort, reflection, and adjustment can make a difference over time. This expectation is not naive optimism. It is grounded in observation. People do change. Habits can be reshaped. Skills improve with practice. Emotional reactions soften with understanding. These changes do not happen instantly, and they do not happen equally for everyone, but they happen often enough to justify the effort. Living as if choice matters begins with recognizing the time scale on which control actually operates. If control is expected to appear at every moment, it will often seem absent. Automatic reactions, emotional impulses, and ingrained habits can overwhelm conscious intention in the short term. This can lead to frustration and self-criticism if freedom is imagined as immediate command. But when control is understood as something that unfolds across time, expectations shift. A single failure does not define capacity. A single impulse does not define character. What matters is the pattern. Over days, weeks, and years, people influence the conditions that shape their future behavior. They choose environments, relationships, routines, and values. These choices alter what feels possible later. This is why living as if choice matters often means focusing less on isolated decisions and more on systems. Instead of asking, why didn't I choose better in that moment? A more effective question is, what conditions made that moment difficult and how can they be changed? This shift does not deny responsibility, it redirects it. Responsibility in this sense becomes forward-looking. It is less about assigning blame for what has already happened and more about shaping what is likely to happen next. This approach aligns with how learning actually works. Feedback influences future behavior most effectively when it points toward adjustment rather than condemnation. Living as if choice matters also involves accepting limits. There are constraints that cannot be wished away. Genetics, early experience, health, and circumstance all set boundaries on control. Pretending otherwise leads to unrealistic standards and unnecessary guilt. Acknowledging limits allows effort to be targeted where it is most effective. This does not mean giving up when limits are encountered. It means working within them. A person who recognizes their own vulnerabilities can plan around them. Someone who knows they struggle under stress can build in recovery. Someone who understands their habits can design environments that support better outcomes. These strategies are not signs of weak will. They're expressions of informed agency. Another aspect of living as if choice matters is how people interpret their own thoughts. If every thought is treated as command, behavior becomes reactive. If thoughts are recognized as events that arise rather than orders that must be followed, space opens up. This space is where regulation happens. This does not require denying that thoughts have causes. It requires recognizing that not every mental event needs to determine action. Awareness allows for observation without immediate commitment. This ability is not absolute, but it can be strengthened with practice. Over time, it changes how decisions feel. Living as if choice matters also influences how people relate to others. When agency is treated as real but constrained, interactions become more nuanced, expectations become more realistic, empathy increases without erasing accountability. People are seen as capable of change but not infinitely flexible. This perspective supports patience without passivity. It allows room for explanation without excusing harm. It encourages boundaries that protect others while still recognizing the role of context. In social life, this balance is difficult but essential. Importantly, living as if choice matters does not mean ignoring the influence of unconscious processes. It means taking them seriously. When unconscious tendencies are recognized, they can be anticipated. When patterns are named, they can be addressed. Awareness does not eliminate influence, but it allows influence to be managed. This approach also changes how success and failure are understood. Success becomes less about proving independence and more about aligning conditions, effort, and understanding. Failure becomes information rather than verdict. This does not remove disappointment, but it reduces despair. There is also a quiet form of agency involved in values. People do not choose their initial values, but they can reflect on them. They can notice which values lead to outcomes they endorse, and which do not. Over time, this reflection shapes priorities. This shaping is gradual and often subtle, but it is real. Living as if choice matters means taking that gradual influence seriously. It means recognizing that identity is not fixed, but it is not infinitely malleable either. It is something that is shaped through repeated engagement with the world. Another reason this stance matters is that it preserves motivation without requiring illusion. People do not need to believe they are on cause to believe their actions matter. They need to believe that their actions are part of the causal story. When effort is seen as causally effective, motivation is justified. This also helps avoid the trap of fatalism. Fatalism treats outcomes as independent of action. Determinism does not. In a deterministic system, actions are among the causes that produce outcomes. Confusing these leads to disengagement that is not supported by reality. Living as if choice matters is therefore not an act of denial. It is an alignment with how complex systems actually function. It recognizes that influence flows both ways. Past conditions shape present behavior, and present actions shape future conditions. This stance also has ethical implications. It supports taking responsibility for the effects one has on others, even while recognizing constraints. It supports making amends, setting intentions, and following through, not because one is perfectly free, but because one is capable of response. There is a certain humility built into this way of living. It accepts that control is partial and that effort does not guarantee success. But it also rejects the idea that effort is pointless. It occupies the middle ground where most of human life actually unfolds. People who live as if choice matters do not assume they can always do better. They assume they can sometimes do better, under the right conditions, with the right support, and over time. That assumption is modest, but it is enough. As this discussion approaches its end, what remains is not a conclusion about whether free will exists in some ultimate sense. What remains is a practical orientation. Acting as though choice matters, even in a world shaped by causes, is not a philosophical gamble. It is a way of engaging with reality that reflects how change actually happens. The question, then, is no longer whether choice is pure or absolute. It is whether treating choice as meaningful leads to better outcomes, deeper understanding, and more humane ways of living with one another. As we come to the end of this long exploration, there is no final answer waiting to be delivered, no simple resolution that neatly closes the question of free will. And that is appropriate. Questions like this are not meant to be solved in the way a puzzle is solved. They are meant to be lived with, revisited and refined as understanding grows. Throughout this discussion, the idea of free will has shifted shape many times. It began as an intuitive feeling, moved through philosophy and neuroscience, passed through determinism and randomness, and settled into something quieter and more practical. Not a magical power, not an illusion that leaves us empty-handed, but a set of capacities that allow human behavior to be guided, adjusted, and shaped over time. What matters most is not whether free will exists in some absolute metaphysical sense. What matters is that people can reflect, learn, and change. What matters is that actions respond to reasons, that habits can be reshaped, that environments can be redesigned, and that understanding can alter future behavior. These facts remain true regardless of how the deeper debate is resolved. Reflection itself is a form of agency. Taking time to think about why you act as you do, what influences you, and how you might act differently in the future is not passive. It is one of the ways control is exercised. Even asking the question of free will is already an expression of the very capacities under discussion. There is something important about slowing down with questions like this, especially in a world that often demands quick judgments and simple explanations. Reflection creates space. It interrupts automatic reactions. It allows patterns to become visible. In that space, small shifts become possible. This does not mean that reflection guarantees change. Many influences remain strong, habits persist, constraints remain. But reflection changes the terrain. It alters how experiences are interpreted and how future situations are approached. Over time, those changes accumulate. If there is a choice being made here, it is not a choice between freedom and illusion. It is a choice between rigid thinking and flexible understanding. Between seeing behavior as either fully chosen or fully determined. and seeing it as shaped by many interacting factors, including attention, effort, and learning. Choosing to reflect does not require certainty. It does not require believing that every decision is under perfect control. It requires only the recognition that understanding matters and that understanding can influence what comes next. Perhaps that is why this question persists. Not because it demands a final verdict, but because it invites ongoing engagement. As long as people continue to reflect on their actions, their reasons, and their impact on others, the question of free will remain relevant, regardless of how it is framed. And so, rather than closing with an answer, it makes sense to close with an attitude of curiosity rather than defensiveness, of responsibility without harshness, of effort without illusion, of compassion without resignation. If you take anything forward from this, it does not need to be a position on free will. It can simply be a willingness to notice how choices unfold, how influences operate, and how small adjustments change outcomes over time. That willingness, quiet and unremarkable as it may seem, is already part of what makes choice meaningful at all.